At this point in the series, we have played through a large majority of From Software's recent catalog. Dark Souls, Dark Souls 2, Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, Sekiro, Demon Souls, and analyzed each of their boss encounters. How do they build the bosses up? What does it feel like taking each of them down? And now, at the end of everything, there's one game left to analyze: Elden Ring. The scale of Elden Ring is unlike any other From Software game. The bosses are larger, move faster, and there are far more than ever before. So, join me in this 3-part final installment analyzing all 163 boss encounters of... I'm sorry, 163? There are a lot of encounters, and it's hard to judge them all independently, but god damn it, that's what I'm here to do. I've played this game with the Guts Greatsword, a magic-only run, and for this run, I finally went Dexterity with 2 katanas. I finished Sekiro right before I started this playthrough, so I figured it would be nice and thematic. Here were the rules I went into the run to try to make sure I wasn't overleveled. I wasn't allowed to move into any new area until I completed every boss inside of it, and I put a level cap on my plus 25 weapon, so I could only raise it 2 or 3 stages every time. Overleveling bosses is a little bit inevitable with a roster of 163, but without further ado, let's get started in Limgrave with the bosses of Elden Ring. Throughout the series, first bosses have fallen into one of 2 categories: bosses that empower the player in their defeat, or bosses that aim to disempower the player in the player's death. The Vanguard Demon and Genichiro in Demon Souls and Sekiro accordingly are there to kill you. There is no second attempt, and the player is certainly expected to fight the enemy again later to realize how much they've progressed as a player. Meanwhile, bosses like Asylum Demon and Udex Gundar serve as initial skill checks for new players to gain access into the rest of their game. Elden Ring joins Demon Souls and Sekiro on their approach with the Grafted Scion, a theoretically beatable boss who is designed to almost certainly kill a first-time player. Where the Grafted Scion sticks out from the Vanguard and Genichiro is in 2 big functions. The first is within level placement, which is a strange thing to describe for a tutorial boss meant to kill you, but hear me out. Vanguard and Genichiro are both placed at the end of their respective tutorials. Vanguard arrives after the player has already dealt with multiple enemies, learned the basics of the game's checkpoint system and loot, and Genichiro appears after the player has already faced a mini-boss, ideally understanding the general nature of the game's parry system. The Grafted Scion is the first enemy in Elden Ring, arriving before the game explains any mechanics outside of movement and camera control. Unique weapon arts, jump attacks, shield guards, all of that comes later. Oftentimes, this means players, especially those who were new to the series, would often be overwhelmed by their sheer lack of knowledge rather than the Scion's moveset. That's not to say that the Grafted Scion's moveset is not overwhelming. The Scion is infinitely more chaotic than any of his peers. Vanguard focuses on simple swings and an AoE butt slam, but serves as a challenge via the sheer size of his health bar, the restrictive arena, and the limited damage and healing options the player has. Genichiro attempts to overwhelm the player via speed, but his design is still precise and clear, just from the nature of Sekiro's combat system. The Grafted Scion leans more towards the direction of Genichiro's speed in overwhelming the player, but lacks the clarity of animation that the sword fighter without any gimmicks brought to the table. The Scion can stab the ground multiple times while pressing forward, release a series of strangely delayed slashes as he moves around, and has a huge leap attack. The Scion, like the Vanguard, hits incredibly hard, but combined with Genichiro's breakneck speed, one combo is often enough to take a player out, especially when you combine that with a damage buff halfway through the fight, really cementing in that the player is not expected to survive this duel. On top of that, the Scion's moveset feels a little haphazard. All of the individual moves are difficult to describe or distinguish. Particularly frustrating is this single slash in front of him while he keeps his shield up, which is an incredibly simple move with no real way to counter it. Plus, this thrusting attack is best dodged by moving away from him and watching him finish the attack. It comes out fast enough that once you're in it, even mashing the roll button won't get you out in time to avoid the next barrage. It's clearly telegraphed, and dodging it doesn't have a real reward, so why would you engage at all? The Grafted Scion can be rematched like the rest of his siblings, which is where most of this footage has been coming from. Unlike the rematches with Vanguard and Genichiro, both of which are impossible to miss, the Grafted Scion is a tough-to-find boss. In Liurnia, there's an area with 3 portals. One of those portals leads back to the Grafted Scion. Now, I used this portal first this run, and I still felt overleveled returning to face him. Because of this, there's not much payoff to the Grafted Scion. By the time you reach him again, not only have you already faced him as a mob before, but you feel less like you've improved at the game and more like your numbers are now high enough that he poses no threat. As one final error in design, the death lacks the satisfaction of the others. When you die at the Vanguard, your soul becomes trapped. There is a clear what and how things happen. Genichiro, meanwhile, takes it to the next level and takes your entire arm, opening the gate for the main experience with the prosthetic. After you lose to the Grafted Scion, the screen goes black before the death sticks, there's a sound of falling, and then you're found by Torrent. This transition is so strange and jarring that I thought I had encountered a graphical glitch on my first playthrough and restarted the game. If you do manage to survive your battle with the Grafted Scion, then you do die by falling, and the cutscene works a lot better there. However, again, victory's not intended, and Vanguard and Genichiro, though they have Easter eggs hiding behind them if you do win, still feel good even if they're the ones beating you. I think the Grafted Scion earns a low D grade. Though I have a lot of things I dislike the fight for, and Vanguard definitely has the edge, the fight isn't a complete flop. The design of the enemy and the shock it creates is exciting, and the Grafted Scions are satisfying to take down once you do have the resources to do so, even if their flailing enemy design often isn't very fun to fight and doesn't encourage any fun risks. That said, I've just spent over a page and a half of size 12 font dissecting a fight that kills you in 20 to 30 seconds, so we're probably going to need to pick it up a little bit. At the end of Elden Ring's proper tutorial, which is optional by the way, the player encounters the Soldier of Godrick, and where Grafted Scion was an overtuned foe, I've already beaten the Soldier of Godrick. The Soldier of Godrick, as he is known, dies with almost no effort on the part of the player. His simple swings don't hit hard enough to feel like a threat to any level. There's no surprise in the moveset. After all, this is just a basic enemy that you've been fighting with a little bit more health than the standard variations. There's a discussion to be had later in this video regarding bosses that feel designed as a boss encounter versus bosses designed as mobs placed within these rooms, but footage of the Soldier of Godrick being steamrolled despite the fact that I completely missed getting the riposte is not what I want to do that over. The only contribution that the Soldier delivers is an enemy felled screen at the end of the tutorial and putting the name Godrick into a perceptive player's mind, something Limgrave, as an area, does strive to do, but neither of those are enough to justify its own existence. The Soldier of Godrick earns an early F grade, and frankly isn't worth running through the tutorial for. With the Grafted Scion being designed to kill you near instantly and the Soldier of Godrick only receiving the title of boss by technicality, the first foe that players will usually encounter in the game proper is also one of Elden Ring's new wandering boss encounters, the Tree Sentinel. Not only does he serve as a much more satisfying boss encounter than either of the bosses that came before, but he stands as a much better thesis statement for Elden Ring as a whole. For a first encounter, the Tree Sentinel has a ton of health for unupgraded weapons, but not so much health as to feel impossible. He does enough damage to feel like an unstoppable force for a new player, but not enough to one-shot you or leave a player wondering what just killed them. He's incredibly mobile on his horse, but his attacks more than often do leave clear windows of opportunity, as long as you're putting an emphasis on positioning to stay in close after each of his attacks. This is a really important skill to learn in Elden Ring. Your role is far more powerful here than in a lot of the previous games, maybe Dark Souls 3 excluded, and a lot of enemy movesets encourage rolling in and through attacks, something that made going from Elden Ring to Demon's Souls a uniquely difficult experience. As the Tree Sentinel charges and leaps around, openings initially feel rare, but as you master the fight, they become more and more abundant as you move under his swings and start to dig into him. His leap attacks do mess with the camera, but the timing on the moves all follow a very natural rhythm, which keeps it from feeling frustrating or cheap. There are a few moves, namely his shield bashes, that do break away from his standard rhythm, but tying them all to attacks from the shield does mean that it never starts to feel like the Tree Sentinel is sitting and waiting to attack. The music here is brash and intimidating, while not too cinematic. It makes it feel like an early game boss while still providing a presence. He's also the first example of Limgrave teaching the player absolutely critical lessons. If you can't beat something, come back later. Even on this playthrough, that's what I ended up doing here. I explored the area more, leveled my weapon up to a +2, and then took the Tree Sentinel down. Early leveling in Elden Ring is an intentionally empowering process, and the Tree Sentinel is designed to display how much difference your stats will make as you explore the lands between. In that way, he serves as kind of an optional Iudex Gundyr Asylum demon. He starts impossible, get a couple levels, get a couple upgrades, and suddenly, you're on his level. There is one major blunder for me, however, outside of that occasionally funky camera, and that's his reaction to magic. The Tree Sentinel can, even during what are usually recovery frames, raise his shield and reflect magic back at the player. A magic reflecting shield attack is a cool move in concept, forcing players to engage with the boss rather than standing back and pressing a magic button, but in practice, with the speed that he can execute it, it punishes people experimenting with the magic they started with. On my all-magic run, this boss became an obnoxious enemy until I went and learned the magic that simulated melee attacks, which put a bit of a damper on the extraordinary expression and flexibility that Elden Ring offers with its builds. Even with that, the Tree Sentinel earns a low A grade. I love how he introduces the nature of Elden Ring's open world to the player with just his physical design. Even if a player walks past him the first time, intimidated, he's still teaching his lesson, even if you forget to come back. Whether you take him down as your first enemy demonstrating pure skill, or you empower yourself before returning, he still remains an early highlight. Beyond the Tree Sentinel, ordering bosses in Elden Ring is strange. This list isn't going to match the order I fought them in, even fighting everything in a region before moving on to the next one, because I want to build up towards the key bosses of the region. Past the Tree Sentinel, there are 4 bosses that I consider introductory bosses, the first of which are the Demi-Human Chiefs. Located just on the beach near the player's starting location, players who turned away from the Tree Sentinel, whether it was out of fear or because the game said to go in that direction, the Demi-Human Chiefs end up being one of the first fights players will often find. Each of these 4 bosses are going to be specifically designed to test the player on a specific skill that they need throughout the game. Here, the player is being tested on crowd control and spatial awareness by taking advantage of the strengths and weaknesses of this type of mob. Firstly, as I mentioned, the Demi-Human Chiefs are mobs. Even by the end of Limgrave, the player will be fighting against chiefs in the overworld, which means they lack a lot of punch and polish that you see from other major boss fights. They stagger easily, and that can often rob them of a lot of their impact. So, as a counter to this, the battle is a duo fight. There are 2 chiefs and a collection of demi-human enemies around the area to support them. Unlike some later battles, which I will almost certainly get to, the Demi-Human Chiefs execute this concept better than you'd expect. The chiefs are aggressive, but demi-humans will often scream and jump around, attacking more sparsely. On top of that, one of the chiefs starts far enough back in the cave that he isn't made aggressive unless the player runs too far into the room or if the first chief has died. If you can fight the first chief and the mobs in the restricted space, which is very realistic with how easily everything staggers, you can avoid being overwhelmed. However, the nature of the demi-humans means that keeping just the boss staggered before upgraded weapons is easier said than done. There are enough enemies that attacks are still regularly coming at you, and you can't create too much space between yourself and them without bringing in the second boss. It also introduces the gimmick of the demi-humans as enemies. When their chief goes down, the smaller enemies will retreat. Wordlessly, this fight is communicating exactly how this major reoccurring enemy type ends up working in the overworld and even later boss fights. It walks the line between swarming you and being a good tutorial really well. With that said, as you may have noticed by the footage, the chiefs are incredibly fragile. I played this fight really messily as I learned new weapons, and though they can put out an alright early game offense, at the end of the day, they still feel like mobs. I imagine the low health was designed to make them feel accessible, but it left them feeling hollow, despite some far above average arena design for mobs. Overall, I do think the Demi-Human Chiefs earn a strangely high B grade. As mobs, I'm harsher than usual, but an early game test of spacing using the AI of a common enemy in one of the better duo fights in the game means that they serve their role as an early game test incredibly well. In a more linear game, I may be harsher, but this kind of boss fills Elden Ring's world impeccably. The Beastman of Farum Azula was the first non-Soldier of Godrick boss that I faced when I explored the lands between, so I have a bit of a special place in my heart for him. Unlike the Demi-Human Chiefs, there's nothing that sets the Beastman apart from his later mob variant, and though he is one of the more complicated melee mobs in the game, namely since he is found at the very end of the game, he still struggles to feel like a fully fledged boss. With that said, the Beastman is aggressive enough to hammer in solid fundamentals, specifically forcing players to be aware of their defensive options. He closes the distance better than most early game foes, which keeps melee from getting unfocused or dull, while making ranged options rewarding, yet still engaging. His swings do have a little delay to them, but the delays are more universal, making the fight slower paced rather than trying to catch you off guard with the delayed attacks. Past his natural swings and attacks, he has one major noteworthy attack. He'll roar before diving into a 6-hit combo. He does a lot better than the Grafted Scion here, as the final move of the attack is clear, easy to predict, and offers a good moment to sneak in and punish if you successfully evaded the rest of the barrage. And landing huge guard counters on this boss during my first playthrough is what made Elden Ring the first game in the series that I actually immediately wanted to use a shield. When I think about a tutorial boss of Elden Ring, this is who I think of. I went here first this playthrough as well, and you can see I'm unlearning the blocking timing and learning to roll earlier as the fight progresses. Though it's a simple battle, it does a great job whetting the player's appetite and allowing them to become more comfortable with their playstyle of choice. I also want to shout out something that will likely be very rarely brought up in this video, but the specific color palette of the Beastman's design does some great work here. His gray and black palette feels almost out of place among the more brown and green tones of Limgrave. Combined with the name, it's one of the first moments that begins to evoke that feeling of a massive world that you've only just begun to explore. Where the Beastman struggles, however, is replayability. All he has is a niche defensive talisman and 1,000 runes as a reward, so the Beastman isn't really worth revisiting for any reason other than to be a punching bag, which is a shame. That's going to be the case for a lot of these smaller bosses, unfortunately. They're designed for exploration, not for replayability. Personally, I think that the Beastman of Farum Azula should have been the boss at the end of the tutorial. He's exploitable enough to be accessible while still unique enough to stick out on a first playthrough, at least for an early game fight built from a late game mob. Overall, I think it does still earn a solid C grade. Similarly to the Demi-Human Chiefs, it displays a smart use of a mob to help onboard new players to the tempo of Elden Ring. I've seen people go both ways on the Erdtree Burial Watchdog's visual design, but I personally adore how this thing looks. My entire first battle with it, I was laughing out loud, and seeing people's first reactions of confusion when this thing strolls up on them will never not be hilarious. I have a friend who is deathly afraid of dolls and puppets. Hey, check out our Pathfinder 2e actual play. And watching him panic is one of my favorite Elden Ring memories. The rotating doll-like legs, the rigid sword, and his goofy face are hilariously unsettling, and do a great job making the boss stand out from other early game encounters. The third of those 4 bosses in the initial area around Limgrave, the Erdtree Burial Watchdog is the most boss of those 4 bosses. He very rarely appears as a mob and only in the late game, making him feel far more unique than a lot of the other enemies in the area. Every move has some bizarre delay and timing, which is something a lot of Elden Ring bosses utilize, but those delays specifically add to the unnatural atmosphere here. It doesn't swing like a human, it's just mimicking the way humans would swing and lunge. The delay is not as carefully executed as a fight like the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, as some of the attacks can end up feeling unnatural or repetitive to dodge. The double spin in particular can't be rolled directly through, forcing the player to back away rather than letting them stay in the Watchdog's face. The jump attack is also a particularly interesting one, as for some reason, the Watchdog will repeat it 2 to 3 times. It messes with the camera and is satisfying to dodge once, and then it becomes a bit boring. If your timing is off, it's a really tough move to break back into tempo with, especially since you'll still have your last dodge in mind. The Watchdog's role as one of those first 4 initial boss fights is to teach you about learning the unique timings of moves and to watch for specific calls for those hardest to dodge moves. The Beastman slightly touched on the calls with the scream into the combo, but almost everything the Watchdog does is highly telegraphed, then whips to the attack in an instant. This is a recurring piece of design within the game that I'll get into more later when it becomes a problem, but right here it does a great job encouraging analyzing movesets right off the bat. Personally, I think the Watchdog has a solid introduction as a recurring boss fight, earning a B grade. The strange timing holds it back, and though it stands above other enemies in the starting area, it doesn't carry the same punch into later battles. The Stonedigger Troll is an interesting case when it comes to boss design. As the last of those 4 kind of tutorial fights, by the time you've found the mine it dwells in, you've likely faced a number of these trolls on your horse. However, the Stonedigger Troll has one big difference. You can't use one-handed attacks without bonking off. You have to two-hand, jump, or use heavy attacks to not bounce off the stone into the long recovery animation. The bosses at the end of mines are particularly important in Elden Ring. They're important to run through in order to keep your items properly leveled or get the gems that allow you to buy the items to upgrade new weapons. Because of this, I'm going to carry these bosses with a bit more weight, as they'll be some of the most regularly encountered by players. As I mentioned, the Stonedigger Troll is a bit of the finale of that first quad of bosses. The Beastman tested your basic combat knowledge, the Watchdog focused on unique timings, and the Chiefs focused on positioning and crowd control. The Stonedigger Troll wants to make sure you understand attack mechanics outside of the R1 button. Jump attacks, weapon arts, and charge attacks are the only way to land real hits here, and placing it with weapon upgrades means players are more likely to run into the test. On top of that, the game doesn't try to hide the gimmick, as the miners in the area prior have the same defensive ability, and encourage you to engage by charging a heavy attack to start the fight. The troll just complicates the mechanic introduced by not standing still while you prepare your opening attack. It also makes the trolls in the overworld feel significantly less intimidating. After you've fought a troll one-on-one and upgraded your weapon as a result, trolls become very doable foes. And with Stormveil Castle surrounded by trolls, this might give new players the confidence they need to head up that path, which the entirety of Limgrave is built to guide players towards. In that way, it's one of the best practical uses of a mob as a boss. The enemy intimidates new players into exploring the region, then the boss gives players the confidence to head back towards those enemies. The big issue with the fight comes from the moveset. Trolls are simple enemies compared to a lot of bosses, with some larger than expected invisible shockwave hitboxes on their heavy attacks, which can lead to some hits landing at what feels like bizarre times. But with the defensive mechanic and intentional guidance towards Stormveil Castle placed in one of the most frequently visited locations, the Stonedigger Troll does earn a spot in the low C grade. I wish there was a more detailed moveset here, because the concept of an optional but easy to find boss encouraging players to explore diversity within their moveset is incredible, and earns the troll most of its points. I also think that more than one fight should have used this mechanic in Limgrave, because it's such an important lesson to teach in Elden Ring. There are a lot of Elden Ring bosses that are difficult to analyze after a few playthroughs. Bosses can, as I alluded to before, be categorized into remembrance bosses, which clearly have more detail put into them, or standard bosses, which are honestly more akin to mini-bosses from Sekiro than any other boss from the Souls series. When that's combined with a wide selection of Elden Ring bosses being reused as enemies, it means it's easy for bosses to lack some of the weight of earlier entries in the series. Some bosses, though, such as the Grave Warden Duelist, land in a strange midpoint, where they feel like a mini-boss due to a few of the design decisions, but they boast ideas and concepts that you'd expect in a full boss fight. With an intuitive moveset with satisfying gaps and range from the concept of dual-wielding hammers connected by a chain, the Grave Warden Duelist is incredibly satisfying to dodge around and punish after his barrages end. Even magic builds have unique challenges here, as they come face to face with his more ranged focused moveset. The issue is that there is nothing outside of that solid combat, and his health pool is tragically low even amid early game opponents. I also love that he forces shield users to really think about stamina as they decide when to block and when to counterattack. Though guard counters are a great strategy for stopping his attacks, his follow-ups mean you can't just mash that guard counter button. His range can make him difficult to approach, but the weapon animations still have a satisfying weight behind each and every swing. However, the fact that his moveset leans towards that more basic side means that there aren't multiple ways strings of attacks can end, like some of the engaging endgame fights. When he starts a combo, it'll always go the same way. But even with that said, I think the Grave Warden works well as an early game boss that evolves into an enemy. I will say he lacks a little bit in atmosphere. He has his dramatic cloak toss, yes, and I do adore that, but that's really all he has. Like most average bosses, he earns a solid C grade. He does his job well, and he is fun to fight no matter your build, but he doesn't make you want to ensure that your friends have found the Murkwater Catacombs and experienced the thrill of the Grave Warden Duelist. Having been a recurring NPC all the way from Demon's Souls, Patches has finally upgraded to the next level and become a boss fight. Now in classic Patches style, he takes his opportunity in the boss spotlight to poke at you from behind his shield and spit acid that makes you take a little bit more damage when he pokes you from behind his shield. If this wasn't Patches, this would be an irritating NPC fight, but Patches' characterization carries this fight a lot, especially for a returning player. The fact that he attacks you after you look through his things, the fact he'll try to surrender halfway through his health bar, and the fact that he fights like an absolute coward is hilarious. Though it's not a fun or exciting battle, it is a great character introduction. The reward from the fight is also one of the most relevant. Patches is how you get access to Margit's Shackle, which is a huge boon for the first major boss in the run. Though he struggles to hold his own as an encounter, the start of an NPC questline is entertaining enough to come back to on repeat playthroughs. I think because of that, it earns a C grade, even with the brittle mechanics. Patches, after all, is just that gosh darn charmin'. Flying Dragon Agheel is one of the more visually stunning fights in the beginning of the game, but he's sadly a hollow encounter on repeat battles. On his first appearance, the loud music, massive fire, and intimidating health bar makes him stand far above the bosses you've found up to this point. The dead trees in the area burning and collapsing as a visual marvel really sells the concept of field bosses in a way even Tree Sentinel didn't. He's also unique in that he's one of the only boss variations designed to be fought utilizing Torrent, which is a fun change of pace from many of the other fights. His attacks come out slowly, letting you maneuver around, and his fire covers a large enough area that Torrent's speed becomes a tremendous asset. Now, I do wish there were more bosses built around a more in-depth moveset from Torrent, because the player feels really cool when the horseback combat works. However, that's the big catch. Combat on Torrent is not great. Dodging enemies on horseback often requires you to expect and prepare for attacks before they begin, and the player's options to attack are more limited on horseback. It lingers a lot behind the playground that Elden Ring's combat usually is. And even outside of the issues with Torrent, my praise for Agheel ends at that point. Like Midir in Dark Souls 3, dragons will take more damage if you attack their heads. But unlike Midir, Agheel doesn't seem to be designed around that in the same way, often keeping his head up and out of the way, with many attacks not having a punishable window. The most reliable way I found to fight him is to run around and slap his wings and ankles, switching ankles if he stomps, which is the most boring attack in his impressive arsenal. Stepping back a little when he decides to turn around means you can avoid his bite, which you can punish immediately, and then run back to his ankles. The end result of this is that the fight feels long the first go around and bloated whenever you replay the game. He does do a ridiculous amount of damage, potentially one-shotting the player with many attacks, but still fits in among early game bosses just from how easy avoiding them are. Outside of Stormveil Castle and one mid-game boss who's hiding in Limgrave, Agheel gives the most runes in the area. But despite his presentation and damage potential, he ends up feeling hollow and simplistic. The presentation, especially for an early game battle, does keep him out of the bad grades, allowing him to join most of Limgrave thus far with a C grade. I know I'm giving a lot of those just far, but don't worry, it'll start varying more as we go through. The Crucible Knight is a deceptively brutal early game opponent, and in this playthrough, when I fought him here before I let myself travel to Eastern Limgrave, he was the boss who ended up taking me the most attempts. The damage he deals is massive, he attacks incredibly fast, and his defensive capabilities force the player into a more reactive state than many other early bosses. Windows where he leaves his shield down is incredibly slim, and tanking a hit means you've missed your opportunity, and likely your next opportunity as well, as finding a good time to heal is a challenge in and of itself. Elden Ring has a few bosses that read your animations, and Crucible Knight is one of those foes. He rushes forward with a punishing shield slam whenever you heal, or cast a spell within his range. It's easy to forget because there are often long delays between his offensive attacks where he sits with his shield up, but that doesn't mean that you're safe to back up and heal. I'm a little split on my opinions of the Crucible Knight. The shield camping can be frustrating in both phases, but it doesn't ruin the fight for me. The attack is straightforward enough that it doesn't feel cheap, just a little overwhelming at times. His moveset is diverse, and his windows are well communicated. I wish there was a way to be more of the aggressive party here, but the first phase has plenty of attacks that are fun to avoid and master. The second phase is where the fight loses it for me. The flying dive attack is a welcome additional to his arsenal. It looks gorgeous, encourages rolling to a position for a counterattack, and when he uses the tail as a primary attack, it's a visually distinct and fun shake-up move to catch you at a further distance than his sword and shield. His follow-up tail attack, however, clashes with the moveset's emphasis on punishing his attacks. His shield forces you to take any opening as soon as they appear, but the follow-up tail is randomly added on to combos, making an attack window become unsafe often after the player has already committed. At that point, the boss has found itself with the lesser version of the problem of the Grafted Scion, where it feels like there's barely ever a real window to attack. Especially considering most of the moveset is so detailed in its design, it makes the follow-up tail particularly disappointing. The first phase here would sit in a B grade, but the second phase is frustrating enough that I think he just bumps down to a C grade, with the first phase earning most of that respect. Another of those rare fights designed around Torrent's inclusion, the Tibia Mariner is an unorthodox boss that I do think sadly misses the mark it was aiming for. Visually, the Mariner works well as a field boss. Taking place in a flooded village, the purple boat sticks out as you ride towards the city. And finding D, who warns you against entering the village, does a great job to build the atmosphere. Blowing his horn, the Mariner summons skeletons, then teleports away. Unfortunately, there are not nearly enough skeletons to be a threat, and whenever the Mariner does decide to deign you with an attack, all he manages to do is kill his skeletons rather than actually hurt you in any real way. Once you find it, it's really just a matter of swinging at him until he dies, or stepping back if he's decided to kill his own minions. I feel like the Mariner is a boss that would have served well as a nighttime-only boss. Purple is such a rare color in this game's palette, and I feel like it would become incredibly prominent at nighttime. On top of that, D specifically warning you to avoid the village at night would then clue the player in that there's a unique thing to find at nighttime. I'll get to this more in the nighttime bosses, but it took me a couple of Deathbirds before I realized that they were a nighttime specific foe. And the Mariner seems like such a natural place to introduce that mechanic that the fact it doesn't seems bizarre. In the day, there are certain angles that the great and striking design of the Mariner kind of fades into the background. Though I love how he looks, I can't give him higher than a D grade. I may enjoy the fight, but it doesn't provide enough of a threat or atmosphere to stay interesting. From what I've seen online, this may be a bit of a hot take, but I think the Bloodhound Knight Darriwil is a great introduction to the Evergaol bosses. He may be simple, but many of the Evergaols are variations of elite enemies or NPC invasions, and Darriwil introduces the idea while providing enough of a challenge to unupgraded players to still stand above a standard enemy. He can take you down quickly using bleed, but he can also be taken down himself just as fast, especially if you've been upgrading your weapon a few times already. His moves, being a collection of slashes and slams that are all well telegraphed, don't feel overwhelming, even if his speed stands out from the rest of the Limgrave boss roster. He's faster than the rest of the early game, and his smoke dash can throw off a new player, but the smoke dash is actually different than the other Bloodhound Knight moves, which we'll get into when we get to those Bloodhound Knights, to make it more accessible to new players. I do wish his design had a little bit more going on. He's got sharpened claws and an animalistic stance, but he just swings his sword, which feels like a missed opportunity. Even with that, I still think Darriwil earns a B grade. There's some untapped potential that could make him stand out a little bit more, but I enjoy the pace and brutal speed of the fight on later playthroughs a lot. Mad Pumpkinhead suffers more than anything else from bad map placement. Sitting in East Limgrave in a bit of a tough-to-find dungeon, Mad Pumpkinhead still feels balanced to be one of the first bosses you fight, despite his position, meaning he won't be found until later, since you have to pass by a group of rune bears to reach him. After all, you even encounter one as an enemy in Limgrave on the bridge potentially before you encounter him, and despite struggling in a normal playthrough, he does justify his status as an important encounter. The arena here is ridiculously small, and Pumpkinhead keeps on pressure pretty well. He doesn't take any damage on his head, forcing you to find a way to press behind him and attack there. The limited arena is the primary mechanical highlight here. It forces you to really focus on hitting your dodge timing skip behind him. He does rotate a little faster than I'd like, and I wish he attacked to spin rather than just turning towards you, as that's something that's always been a major pet peeve of mine. And if it was just his moveset and arena in a vacuum, Mad Pumpkinhead would be at the high end of the D grade. But there's one thing that I'm not sure was intentional, but I think carries him a little bit. Behind him is the first NPC merchant who sells magic, which means that if a returning player has selected a magical starting class and knows to come here first, running past those harder challenges, Mad Pumpkinhead serves as a counter to the early magic they'll have. Taking less damage from the front means you're still needing to weave in and out of attacks and demonstrate your ability to do such, and the small arena means you can't rely on distance. You have to demonstrate your ability to both dodge and use magic. I still wish, however, he was in the opening areas of Limgrave rather than being hidden in the east. But as the guardian of magic in the early game, he just edges his way into the C grade. The arena may add to the fight's tension, but the Pumpkinhead himself lacks the health necessary to stand out as more than an enemy on this side of the map. Considering how frequently dungeons and arenas are reused for bosses in the game, I am very baffled that the Guardian Golem was awarded such a unique dungeon and boss arena, and I don't know why it seems to have less health than the random golems found in the field of Limgrave. The Guardian Golems are some of the enemies that suffer from camera issues the most. The Golem is absurdly tall, and you'll spend most of the fight standing at its feet without a clear line of sight to most of its body. In practice, you want to land a couple of jump attacks to knock the Golem down, get some damage, and then start jumping again as he stands up. If you're fast enough, he can be stun-locked, and if you aren't stun-locking them, their delayed slams, fire breath, and stomps can easily catch you off guard. Not through clever design, just because they're often impossible to see. You'll be going off sound cues or memorization as to how the attacks work and change the Golem's posture, rather than reacting to his movements naturally. The sound design within this fight is also unusually unpolished for a From Software game. The boss music is softer and more tense, almost evoking a feeling of being chased, but the heavy thuds and slams of the Golem don't really match the lighter dancing strings. It's tough to rate the Golem because it feels strangely forgettable. The camera is bad, but the fight is so bland that it's hard to be angry or upset at the design decisions. It's the first of a lot of bosses that'll suffer from that, where they land in this strange vacuum where you just don't really care. And I think that earns it a D grade. I don't know if there was another boss that was cut or moved elsewhere, but the Guardian Golem seems like such an underwhelming ending to such a unique dungeon. To my knowledge, this is the first and only boss in the series that does not start their battle at full health. The implication that the assassin killed whatever was in the catacombs originally is really fun, and the lower health serves as a great way to introduce a mini-boss that aims to remain threatening throughout the game. Fighting a Black Knife assassin is often frenetic, as they'll leap around the arena at a ridiculous speed and boast a unique musical theme that fits their combat style masterfully. Although easy to stagger, their moveset is complicated enough to still pose a threat to an unprepared player while avoiding the complication of later Black Knife assassins. The knife stabs here have no additional effects. You'll be slashed and stabbed as the assassin glides around the arena, and there's no special tricks that she'll utilize here. It sets up the future mini-boss well, and features the Crimson Assassin Dagger as one of the most important early game rewards. I don't think I go through a playthrough in Melee without picking this thing up, it's just that good. Ironically enough, the Dark Souls series very rarely played with light and shadow in a significant way in their boss fights, but this battle does so beautifully. The Black Knife Assassin becomes an almost featureless silhouette in the darkness and feels like a black ink splotch in the light. Combined with the deliberateness of the assassin rising up to face the player, for a Catacombs fight, the atmosphere created here is way more tense than usual. And though the fight is often over too soon, the pre-damaged nature of the boss means that the brevity makes the boss's atmosphere even more memorable. I'd give the Black Knife Assassin here a B grade. Though infinitely simpler than the true variation of the boss that the player will later become exceptionally well acquainted to, this introduction establishes the enemy type in a memorable, though short, duel. When it comes to nighttime bosses, there are two major varieties, the first being the Knight's Cavalry, who function as a dark parallel for the Tree Sentinel boss template. This first one, fought on the bridge between East and West Limgrave, is the Glaive variation. Most of his Glaive moveset is similar, with thrusts, swipes, short leaps, and stomps and side checks from his horse to throw a unique rhythm into the mix, but the lack of his shield means most attacks keep to about the same tempo. Now, the reason for this limitation on moveset is theoretically because of the core gimmick that the Knight's Cavalry are built upon. The health bar at the bottom of the screen is the rider's health bar. Unlike the Tree Sentinel, there are two separate entities that work as one unit. Once you do enough damage, the horse goes down and you get some time to damage the cavalry before he stands up and begins to theoretically battle you as a typical knight enemy. Though the moveset here does feel more like an enemy than a boss, I do really enjoy the simplicity of the knight's cavalry after the horse drops. His primary source of power has been removed, and with it, so has most of the threat and offense that he can output. After a short amount of time on their feet, the knight's cavalry respawn their horse. I'm not certain if there's a timer or damage counter on this, because I've seen some of them do it the moment they stand up, and others, like this encounter, never get the chance to summon it again. Personally, I really like the concept of there being a delay while resummoning, because taking the cavalry down and removing his greatest asset is a really satisfying concept. And though, yes, you get the damage, watching him fall off his horse, stand up, and immediately resummon it kinda ruins the gimmick. As I mentioned, there are only a few main boss categories that will appear at nighttime, the Knight's Cavalry and the Deathbirds making up a large majority of them. And though the Knight's Cavalry does look great at night, it does make this one's location a little bit bizarre. The Knight's Cavalry guards the southern bridge between East and West Limgrave, stopping anyone from passing, so long as it's nighttime. Now, out of all the Knight's Cavalry, this was the only one I needed to look up to find. I wish there was some other way to tell where to look for the Knight's Cavalry, because though the fights are fun and dynamic, they're all a little too well hidden, particularly considering that they're looking for you. I have two other beefs with the Knight's Cavalry, and the first is their pathing AI. They really struggle with thigh-high walls, to the point that some later variations are incredibly easy to convince to leap off a cliff. This bridge in particular is massive, and though part of me wishes it was a little tighter to force you closer to the cavalry, another part of me knows how much the cavalry would get himself stuck on the wall, or straight up fling himself to death. Secondly is how they react to magic. Now, I don't have footage of my magic playthrough, but the only thing that reliably hits him is magic that simulates melee. Everything else, he and his horse do a little leap sidestep out of the way, and it became one of my least favorite bosses in the game trying to fight at range, because the only engagement was discouraging you from trying in the first place. Overall, I think this first Knight's Cavalry earns a high C grade. When you're playing with ranged magic, it is a miserable experience, but taking down his horse in melee is really fun and rewarding. His atmosphere is great, but his placement and story feel a little too disconnected. When I first wrote up notes of this script variation, I had monologues about how much I hated the Deathbirds, how all their attacks felt too bizarrely timed with strange shockwave hitboxes, and their too thin bodies made them difficult to hit with the camera, and to an extent, some of those things are true. Attacks from the Deathbirds come out quickly and cover a lot of range, and occasional attacks that lunge forward and then lunge back with a shockwave are unintuitive. Slight delays in between combos made learning this boss uniquely tough as the game progressed. However, I started to grow on their unique moveset and design to the point where some of my favorite endgame fights were with the Deathbirds. Following in the stead of now so many bosses that came before, the Deathbirds want you to hit their head. Deathbirds have a ton of hit points, being some of the tankiest non-remembrance bosses in the game, and though they definitely do pose more of a threat than other bosses in the surrounding region, it means that they atmospherically do what the Knight's Cavalry does not. You are told that the lands between are more dangerous at nighttime, and for the most part, they really aren't. Whenever a Deathbird lands, however, that region will become instantly more dangerous. Deathbirds are designed, first and foremost, to punish panic rolling and sprinting. You have to keep the Deathbird on screen and focus on keeping your distance while making sure to stay close enough to hit his head when the opportunity arises. The camera still isn't great. Dodging into some attacks while locked onto the head does mean that, as the head wiggles forwards and backwards, it can go past your character, causing the camera to rotate with it. Unlike a lot of other melee threats, it's often not clear when the Deathbird is or is not done attacking. He can throw out multiple swings and then almost suddenly stop and resume stalking you. It can be frustrating as you'll miss a window of opportunity, but it is also great at making the beast feel more terrifying and unpredictable. This particular encounter has a couple of problems with placement. Firstly, and I know this is because I do not have a high-end PC, but this boss was one of the ones that my game really struggled with. Caught in the storm around Stormvale Castle, surrounded by 5 trolls and a ton of small animals, this fight ran worse than everything else in the entire game. And on the matter of those trolls, the Deathbird is far too mobile a boss to be so close to enemies of that size. It is incredibly easy for the Deathbird to move in such a way that you have to attract a troll to the battle. And especially considering how disorienting the camera rotating around on lock-on can be, it's easy to head the wrong direction. Deathbirds also really struggle on slopes. It can make their head sit out of reach, it can make their attacks feel like they're missing the ground, and it just makes the impact feel a lot less powerful. This Deathbird in particular spawns on a slanted stone platform that your character can get stuck on, forcing you to try to move the bird away from the trolls and onto a hill. It isn't a great introduction to the enemy, even if it does become more engaging on later playthroughs. Overall, I think the first Deathbird earns a C grade. I know Deathbirds get a lot of flack, and I was a part of that for a while. And though this match certainly is one of the worst arenas, bearing down and fighting it early game gave me a lot of respect for the enemy. That said, there is a third, less common nighttime boss. And though the Knight's Cavalry and Deathbird are both decent fights, they pale in comparison to the Bell-Bearing Hunter, who is by far my favorite nighttime duel. Sharing a moveset with what would later be a major boss, the Bell-Bearing Hunter feels incredibly cinematic, being one of the first bosses in Limgrave that feels like a fully fledged boss encounter. Making the fight only happen at night means that the harsh reds of his sword swings and grabs stick out incredibly well here. The browns and grays almost fade into the background of the shack, and the moment any of those more dangerous attacks come out, it is clear that the hunter is a threat. He's also the only of the Limgrave nighttime bosses that I'd say is well placed. During the daytime, a merchant sits at this shack, which means if you travel here at night expecting to shop or sell, you turn towards the shack and suddenly watch as this figure teleports in and prepares to fight. It makes for an incredible moment. Bell bearings are also some of the best loot to find from bosses as you upgrade your shop back up to top shape, which means the boss is always worth encountering. And that gets me to the moveset. As I mentioned, the Bell-Bearing Hunter later on becomes one of the great enemies, Elemer of the Briar, a rather insignificant boss fight that we'll run into in part 2. I absolutely love this design here. Attacks come out quickly and feel powerful, with enough variation in tempo and range to stay exciting while avoiding feeling cheap. The Bell-Bearing Hunter does a ton of damage for this early in the game, often being able to two-shot a new player, but it's rare for any attack to catch you off guard with how clear and telegraphed this moveset is. I love the concept behind how this enemy fights so much that one of my first Pathfinder 2e characters was designed around the concept of using a floating sword as a weapon, and I used footage of this boss when pitching the combat style to my DM. He not only makes the night more dangerous, but he serves as an overwhelming early game challenge that remains fair and fun. The Bell-Bearing Hunter is one of the best field and nighttime bosses in the game, and it is a shame that they can be missed because they are incredible. I think that the Bell-Bearing Hunter is the strongest fight so far, earning a high A grade. I also need to mention that, despite being such a brutal early game challenge, the fact he spawns so close to the Grace encourages players to be aggressive and start to rack up damage as he spawns in. He just does everything so well. The Ulcerated Tree Spirit is one of those bosses that feels like I shouldn't be talking about it yet, but this can technically be the first proper boss fight players have access to after the Soldier of Godrick. If the player chose the right starting gift, they can even face it before the Tree Sentinel. With that being said, it is most certainly not designed to be fought here, or even fought among other Limgrave bosses. This boss provides the player with more souls than Margit, and does a ton of damage for this early in the game. However, being one of the first bosses who drops a golden seed to provide you more flask usage, the Ulcerated Tree Spirit is one of the most important bosses to find in battle. Before I get into the moveset and camera issues that I'm sure are evident from the footage currently playing, one of the biggest issues with the Ulcerated Tree Spirit is its dungeon. Not in the sense of the run back being bad, or even the area being bad. I actually really enjoy the challenge of these huge chariots capable of nearly killing you in one hit that you have to stealth and weave around. They're really exciting enemies. The issue is that, with the area being so focused on killing you in nearly one shot, it doesn't warn you that you are violently underleveled. And once you get down to the bottom of this huge area, to this Stake of Marika checkpoint, leaving the battle to come back later means doing that incredibly tough dungeon a second time. But the biggest issue is that the enemy is incredibly large and unintuitive. It takes up so much space that the game is constantly making parts of its body invisible so that the player can see. Attacks constantly come in from off-screen, and though the spirit does have tells for every spin, slam, and breath attack it uses, the boss initially flails around so wildly that it's never clear what is and what is not happening. Compare it with another boss who rarely stopped moving, the Guardian Ape. Even with that consistent movement, there were still moments where you could feel the ape start to go passive or become more aggressive. The Ulcerated Tree Spirit does not have that. This is also the first boss on the list to boast a second phase where its damage becomes boosted by fire. Effectively though, all this second phase does is increase the damage the Tree Spirit does and add some particle effects, as well as one AoE burst that can be tough to notice is coming out. Usually, if the Tree Spirit ever fully stops moving, that means you should probably back up. With that said, though you can't tell what's happening, the moveset can still be learned to an almost uncannily intuitive degree. On my successful run here, I got a hitless fight, which felt incredibly strange with how hard it is to see if you need to dodge, or if the spirit is just flailing in a direction that has no chance of hitting you. I'm not even sure how to describe it, but there is a logic to this chaos that can be learned. It doesn't mean the boss is necessarily any more fun to fight, but it does mean it isn't as rage-inducing as bosses like the one Reborn. There is a rhythm to this fight, it just isn't effectively communicated visually. I think the Ulcerated Tree Spirit does earn a D grade. Some people might think he deserves a little worse with his messy camera, but the fact that the moveset has such a natural rhythm definitely needs to be respected, because it shows how much thought can go into these movesets from a conceptual standpoint, even if it doesn't execute quite correctly. And only 21 bosses into the list proper, we have finally reached Elden Ring's first real boss encounter, our first great enemy, Margit, the Fell Omen. All of Limgrave, every introductory boss, the overworld design, all of it builds up to this battle. Margit is a heavy challenge for a new player and is here to cement the lesson taught by the Tree Sentinel. If you aren't dealing enough damage or you don't have enough health, you can explore and come back. For a potential first boss, Margit is met only by Gascoigne in terms of detail. Compared to Fainling, Giant, or Udic Gundyr, he stands as a far more intimidating challenge. Most of Margit's moveset is built around his staff, using slow and deliberate swings and spins with the occasional dagger throw from his more magical offhand. Though it is satisfying, it's also one of the first times Elden Ring starts to indulge a little too much in its animations. Some of the delayed attacks, like the horizontal swipe, feel satisfying. There's a moment of pause, but the attack still comes out in a reasonable time. This vertical slam similarly feels just delayed enough to feel like an inverted variation of his quick uppercut. The issue, and the attack that has been memed to hell and back with animations and videos, is when he two-hands his staff, lifts it above his head, and holds it while spinning in place while bringing it down incredibly quickly. When you put this attack back to back with how fast some of his combos can get, particularly within his second phase, it feels like the fight will come to a complete halt and sit in slow motion for a moment. As I mentioned with the Crucible Knight, certain bosses have attacks that read your animations. Margit specifically uses his dagger throw to deal small chip damage and disrupt a low poise build. Rather than being as frustrating as some other animation reads, it keeps this fight dynamic. Margit feels like he's always stalking, waiting, and watching for his opportunity to rush forward, and it helps build the atmosphere of what is a pretty straightforward battle. And on the topic of that atmosphere, Margit does a fantastic job. Elden Ring, of course, has no real linear order outside of final bosses, but this is usually the first cutscene that players will run into, and it does a decent job setting the stakes. Margit looks like he teleports in before leaping down, but as players progress, they'll actually realize this is Margit creating an illusory duplicate of himself to try and kill the player, which is a great detail. When he jumps down, he creates one of the single most anime-ass effects in this game series yet. He makes a windstorm from the sheer force of landing. Is it ridiculous? Yes. Is it also very funny and my favorite? Yes. The voice actor here does a fantastic job, both in the introduction and when he enters Phase 2. On a first playthrough, it almost feels like the voice actor is holding back. Even when he begins to summon more powerful weapons, there's a restraint within his voice. I'll get into it more when we reach Morgott in Lindell, but the temperance here pays off for the voice actor to deliver an incredible performance when Margit returns for his true encounter. And of course, that naturally brings into the second phase. Margit begins by summoning a hammer, leaping feet and feet into the air, and bringing it down. Like some of his longer staff swings, there's a lot of delay in this attack, but there is so much happening within the leap that it doesn't feel like an unnatural stop. His entire moveset expands at this point. Not only does he gain the leap attack to utilize again, but he starts to use the hammer as a combo finisher that is a much more satisfying delayed attack than his smash down with the staff. He also starts summoning a sword that he dual wields alongside his staff. It adds a few more hits to each combo, but changes the animations behind a lot of them to make even one more attack feel so much busier as he spins, summons, unsummons, and swaps the weapons constantly. It's a great build-up and starts to set up the concept behind many of the attacks that the remastered version will introduce without spoiling that later encounter. On top of that, player exploration is rewarded in a huge way here. After all, if you've beaten patches, as I mentioned before, you can have Margit's Shackle, which will pin Margit down and allow you to get a few free hits in. Elden Ring is intentionally a lot more accessible than earlier entries in the series. With the combination of Spirit Ashes and items like Margit's Shackle, players who are struggling can still be satisfied by bosses like Margit as they experiment with what use of their tools puts them in the best position. On top of that, having that weakness loops Margit into that same thing that he started his design with. He is the wall designed to force you to explore Limgrave, and if you listen, you are rewarded by being able to absolutely demolish him. I'll get more into the clever evolution of his moveset when we loop back around in what will probably be part 3 of this series, but Margit sets some incredible groundwork for bosses to come, while also serving his role in Limgrave. Everything in Limgrave pushes you towards Stormveil Castle. By having a required boss before entering, the game is effectively stat checking or skill checking you before you prepare to face the final dungeon and boss of the region. It puts players into a great position while they'll explore Limgrave as much as their skill needs them to. Overall, I think Margit earns a high A grade. Though lacking the spectacle of other fights, he delivers a satisfying experience for both old and new players as they move their way towards the first major hurdle of this game, while also setting up a spectacular rematch that will one day serve as the gateway to the late game. And at the end of Stormveil Castle, we reach what all of Limgrave has been building towards. What is usually the first remembrance boss players will run into as they explore Elden Ring for the first time: Godrick the Grafted, a boss who also holds the title of being my personal favorite boss encounter in the game. The name of the game with Godrick here is Presentation, and every aspect of this fight is immaculately placed together. You start to hear his name right after your journey begins, and all grace leads here towards this confrontation, and the game sells this fight hard despite how early in the game the encounter lands. Similar to most of From Software's library, Godrick's voice actor Ramon Tikaram does an astonishing job establishing this character in such a short time. The reveal of the grafted arms on his back pushing away the golden cloth to reveal the horror that he's turned himself into is beautifully uncanny, and combined with the almost divine reverence present in all of his lines, sells the player on the pure delusion that Godrick exists within. My one regret is that the Grafted Scion and creatures like it really aren't built up enough in Limgrave or the castle. There are a few rooms that make use of piles of flesh or some of Godrick's creations, but I wish the game had really leaned into an army of flesh. The first phase here is Elden Ring combat at its best. Every defensive subsystem the game provides gets a chance to shine here, making different moves threatening and engaging in unique ways to different builds. Ground slams can be avoided with a well-timed jump, encouraging jump attacks. A wind spin attack that turns into tracking projectiles encourages using a shield to block rather than precise rolling or running to escape the missiles. All his combos are long but leave wide openings once you learn them, particularly if you're able to dodge. The animators have also made clever use of his multiple limbs to create dynamic poses that always make it clear exactly what attack is coming next. The sloped arena, which is usually something these fights often struggle with, never feels out of place here. It works really well with the rolls and leaps that Godrick employs, and it never feels like you or he are clipping into the floor. On top of that, the damage is well tuned for the early game. He stands above the other bosses in Limgrave while still feeling like an early game challenge. Some of his attacks do come out faster than others within the region, like his wind attack, but those attacks don't deal much damage and don't combo into anything reliably, which means the game is training your reaction speed without throwing you into the deep end. In most linear action games, enemies gradually speed up over the course of the game. Just look at Sekiro, Dark Souls 3, or Hollow Knight. Elden Ring does not have the luxury of linearity, so having the linchpin bosses have moves that begin to train faster reflexes later bosses will 100% require is a great way to start the player towards the breakneck pace that later boss fights will rush at them with. Halfway through his health bar, he'll do a fake-out stagger and lop off his own arm with a perfectly delivered scream. It's a small detail, but if you stood in front of him waiting to get a visceral attack here, you can actually get hit by his axe, and I just really love that. Within another cutscene, he grabs the dragon head the arena is built around and delivers one of my favorite lines in From Software's library. This is probably a great time to mention his soundtrack. Most of the Elden Ring soundtrack up to this point has been alright. There's some nice ambient music exploring Limgrave, and the standard boss themes, though they work for what they are, don't leave a massive impact. Godrick's theme changes that, featuring discordant violins and dramatic vocals that intensify alongside the beginning of his second phase, scores Godrick almost like a horror movie monster in the best way, and it amplifies the scale of the fight even further. Godrick is designed much like Fume Knight. The second phase has attacks that are easier to avoid, but punish your mistakes far more than the first phase did. He adds a brutal grab attack that can one-shot low vigor builds, and a long fire breath that encourages sprinting as a defense. Combine that with an increase of the area of his slams, nearly forcing players to learn to jump if they haven't already, increasing the overall length of his combos, and adding more damage to his wind bursts with some fire after effects now, and the boss remains similar enough to not catch new players off guard, while also adding enough to feel like a sincere escalation. One of my favorite things about boss design, both within and outside of From Software, is the bosses that are designed to be interacted with on unique ways. Now obviously at the base level, all bosses, all enemies are designed to be interacted with, but there are so many intentional gaps in Godrick's moveset, ways to uniquely use shield blocks, jumps, and sprints to turn every attack into an opportunity that Godrick becomes such a satisfying boss to master. If there's anything that Elden Ring did correctly, it's that there's always a counter to get advantage on the bosses. For Godrick, every single counter is a raw part of your moveset, built on your own skill and knowledge. Godrick is an S-grade boss in one of the greatest designed open-world areas I've ever seen, so much so that often the other areas ended up being disappointing as I explored them. Limgrave introduces so much to the player so fast and uses an overall decent boss roster to such an incredible effect, building players to Margit and then climaxing with Godrick. Now it is possible to overlevel Godrick, of course, but unlike the Abyss Watchers, it would require a lot more intent on the part of the player, which is why I'm not dinging him in the same way. And with that, that's Limgrave analyzed. 22 bosses down and over 140 to go. But before we continue north to Liurnia and the Academy of Rea Lucaria, we have to travel to one of the strangest areas in Elden Ring, the Weeping Peninsula. The first of the boss rematches we'll run over today is the second variation of the Knight's Cavalry. Similarly, a nighttime boss, this Knight's Cavalry is much easier to run into than the prior encounters. Placed next to one of the first graces in the peninsula, the chance player has been alive and exploring for long enough to get down to these required crossroads in the region is a lot more common, at least off the personal testimonies I've heard. Until I looked it up online, this was my first Knight's Cavalry, and it feels like a much more fitting introduction to the enemy. The way the silhouette comes up over the hill and through the gap further into the peninsula is very Black Rider-esque, and really gives him a presence compared to the first. This cavalry uses a flail, and though the satisfying follow-through of the glaive is lost with the shorter weapon, there's a lot more variation within the flail moveset. Not only can the horse sidecheck the player like in the glaive version, but the cavalry has a number of short, quick-to-come-out attacks with the flail that stagger the player. On top of that, the long charge attack has the flail spinning throughout the entire movement before he leaps up to crash into the ground. And though the extra hitbox adds only a little more threat to the charge attack, it adds a lot more character. The cavalry running a lap around you as it builds momentum feels much more dynamic than the glaive's version of the leaping attack, which just felt like a moment to heal without much of an issue. Now, I didn't run into it in this fight, but though the glaive looks better on horseback for the main moveset, the grounded moveset for the flail feels really good, and I think is a little better than the glaive. The cavalry two-hand their weapons and move at about the same pace, and though it was necessary for the glaive, it means that the animations on the flail have a ton of power behind every swing. The flail and glaive overall end up about neck and neck as far as variants go, though I personally give the edge to the flail for the impact behind each of its animations. The world placement on this cavalry, however, gives it an edge on the other, save one small detail. This merchant is way too close to what is clearly designed to be a boss arena. It's hard to take the menacing music and threatening spinning of the flail seriously when the merchant is just vibing over here, completely unthreatened and unbothered by the whole exchange. Overall, I will still give the edge to this variation, but the merchant vibing off to the side means it can't quite get above the C grade. Without the merchant, I think this would be the Knight's Cavalry to break into the B grade, but considering how easy it is to reach this area at nighttime, you'd think they'd at least hide the merchant on the other side of the tree line. In Bloodborne's Chalice dungeons, there were a lot of bosses created out of mobs that felt anticlimactic, because the enemy still felt like a mob. Bizarrely, Elden Ring has a slightly different variation of that problem. Enemies that, when met in the overworld, feel as overwhelming if not more than some bosses, but when put in a boss arena, feel comparatively straightforward. The Rune Bear, who only appears as a boss on this one occasion, is one such encounter. Whenever the player encounters a Rune Bear in the overworld, they'll usually find them in tight groups in forests with lots of changes in elevation and geometry to get easily stuck on. Combined with their speed and mobility, they end up being a terrifying threat, especially considering how early they're found in the game. The boss fight is off to a great start, with the health bar only appearing as the bear wakes up when you wander into its cave. However, though most players who've experienced being mauled by these bears will immediately become nervous, the damage this thing deals feels bizarrely low. Just look at this, I'm not even heavily armored and I can easily take 8 or so of the standard hits from this thing, whereas I'd usually be taken down in 3 or 4 hits in Limgrave while needing to deal with being surrounded on top of it. The moveset is decent enough, but there's nothing to surprise the player here. Swipes, slams that do cause some water to splash up in a dynamic way, and one huge grab attack that does the damage you'd expect everything from this fight to deal. The health bar also feels unusually small here. At just around 3,300 hit points, the Rune Bear boss has only 400 more health than the so-called lesser Rune Bears in Limgrave, and even when you run into the enemy in Liurnia, the health bar has almost doubled. But with all this said, we need to take a look at where we are, the Weeping Peninsula. Obviously, there are still plenty more bosses to go through, but the peninsula is a strange case in terms of game design. Every single major region of the game, with the exception of the underground regions, has one of the big named bosses. Godrick, Rennala, Radahn, Rykard, Morgott. The peninsula doesn't have anything comparatively important. My personal theory is that the peninsula is effectively designed to be a training zone. None of the bosses here are particularly well hidden. There are trails and paths that lead to every cave, and every crossroads or major overworld detail has a boss waiting to test you. In this way, the Rune Bear serves a new role, teaching the player that they are ready to fight the mob in Limgrave. And with the comfort facing that, they can explore East Limgrave, they can find the underground access, and maybe they'll realize most big enemies in the overworld can be taken down pretty simply. I may be over-attributing meaning to this, but the Knight's Cavalry is the easiest to find early Knight encounter, and the Rune Bear is barely equal to the versions before it. And as we reach other bosses, they'll all teach similar skills or have similar strange instances. Because of this, what would usually be riding the line between a D and F grade instead sits right at the top of a D grade, almost edging into a C grade. Though the fight won't be anything more than a bump in the road for a veteran of the series, it serves as an incredibly effective morale-boosting boss for the peninsula. And to continue, we have to go back to where this whole channel began, the Asylum Demon, or as the variation is called in the game, the Erdtree Avatar. There's no boss that serves as a more on-the-nose proof of design philosophy of Elden Ring than the Erdtree Avatar. Everything Elden Ring does differently than Dark Souls can be found and pointed at within this fight. The moveset here is beyond familiar, yet the Erdtree Avatar still feels modern and exciting, a challenge for new players and an exciting throwback for the old ones. The primary moveset here almost one-to-one matches with the Asylum Demon. Long tells for swings at his feet and huge hammer slams at range provide the primary melee threat, though the more precise hitboxes means a few of the attacks struggle to connect. Even this dragged on the ground into an uppercut attack was pulled from the Dark Souls 3 version of the Asylum Demon. The famous butt slam attack received the largest buff, as the radius and speed of the attack has been dialed up to account for the Elden Ring player's increased movement speed. It's easy to get thrown off by previous distancing, at least personally. It always takes me a little to remember that the radius of the attack is so much larger now. The Stomp, similarly, focuses a lot on providing an area threat, demanding uses of the roll for invincibility if the player wants to keep the pressure on. The Erdtree Avatar has one big new move, and it's by far the most interesting part of the moveset. A smaller area burst directly in front of him as he smashes the hammer down, followed by a collection of pretty fast-moving projectiles that hone in on the player. Though it's possible to dodge these individually, the player is definitely encouraged to use Torrent to strafe around the boss here, especially since the Avatar will often continue his melee attacks while the projectiles still hunt the player. And this is great because the fact that Torrent is a valid strategy in overworld boss so infrequently is a tragedy. I mean, we're 25 bosses into this video, and the best boy has only been mentioned 3 times. On top of that, all of your general Elden Ring changes are here. Jump and heavily attacks are heavily rewarded, with knockdowns leaving the Avatar wide open. And though the Avatar is on the slower, more methodical side of Elden Ring bosses, I love how intentional every move and attack remained. It's a simple but exciting fight. With all said and done, I think the Avatar does earn a B grade. Though it doesn't fill as perfect of a role for the game as the Asylum Demon, the Erdtree Avatar is one of the best bosses to fill the overworld. Bosses that aren't trying to be the best in the game, but just trying to be a great boss with a fun and engaging design. There are a lot of rematches in Elden Ring, and there are a few recurring patterns between each of them. Sometimes the change is in the arena, restricting the space further to increase the threat a boss would pose. Sometimes variations or slight increases in the power of an attack make an enemy more dangerous, and sometimes there are 4 imps in the arena now for some reason. The second Erdtree Burial Watchdog is nowhere near as defendable as the first variation for a couple of reasons. The biggest strength of the Watchdog is how strangely it moves and leaps towards the player, how uncanny each attack was to watch and avoid. Even if the first Watchdog was missed, this Watchdog does not capture that same feeling, namely because you'll spend most of the fight running around the arena fighting against the hard-to-nail-down imps to avoid being overwhelmed by their fast, bleeding attacks. Usually the only attacks you'll see from this Watchdog is his leap or walking sword slam, as they're the only ones that close the gap. The Watchdog may have enough to close the distance on a spellcaster, but in engaging ranged foe in a gank fight, it is not. There has been one significant change to the moveset from the first variation. With more faces on its head, the Fire Breath attack now covers more area. Though it's an interesting slight evolution, it doesn't play well with the imps as the primary mechanic here. Because the Fire Breath is a get-off-me attack for players too close to the boss, that means it won't trigger until the primary threat of the fight is gone. And this brings me to the strangest point of design. The first Erdtree Burial Watchdog, as I mentioned, was designed to be one of, if not the first bosses players would find and fight while exploring Limgrave. Knowing that the Watchdog, designed to be fought with an unupgraded and nearly unleveled character, has 1200 health, how much of an increase do you think this variation got? This Watchdog only has 1347 health, not even 150 more than the first variation, which is a bizarre choice. Now, as I already referenced, I believe the Peninsula is designed to be a little boost for players who are having a hard time with the tougher bosses in Limgrave, or having a hard time moving up into Liurnia, but come on. With any upgrades on my weapon, the imp still took 4 hits to kill, which seems fine, but then the boss crumpled like a sack of wet paper. It is way too squishy here, especially compared to the imps. Suffering one of the largest drops in grade from the initial variation, I think this Watchdog only sits near the top of a D grade. Though I personally enjoy the moveset, and the increase to the Fire Breath is interesting, the horde of mobs does nothing interesting, and the Watchdog does not feel correctly scaled as a challenge even in the simpler Peninsula. The Evergaol in the Peninsula features another endgame foe turned into a boss fight, and like the Crucible Knight before her, the Ancient Hero of Zamor makes for a satisfying two-phase battle, though it doesn't offer nearly as much of a challenge as the Knight. The first phase of the encounter introduces what makes the Ancient Hero so dangerous: speed and poise. Usually, the faster bosses, like the Black Knife Assassin, can be easily staggered out of attacks once you manage to nail them down. The Ancient Hero of Zamor does not do this, making it very easy to attack when you're nowhere near as safe as you think you are. Spins, thrusts, and other attacks can come out incredibly quick here, and the flexibility of the hero means that sneaking behind her doesn't do nearly as much as it would against other bosses. She does offer a fun solution to the microwave spinning problem I so frequently have. The boss spinning or contorting into each attack means the fight keeps up momentum without ever feeling cheap or gamey. The one thing that does feel cheap is the Get Off Me attack, which comes out absurdly fast. I attacked as another attack was finishing here with lighter weapons, and I was still punished for it. Without magic arranged, this would honestly be one of the scariest no-hit fights for me. It's just that hard not to trade hits. Thankfully, the damage here never becomes too demanding. The hero hits fast and builds up plenty of status, but the player won't find themselves getting two-shot by any of her attacks, meaning that though attacks can catch you off guard or feel too fast, the fight as a whole never feels unfair. The Ancient Hero is a blender, and you're just the rock dropped in to disrupt it before it tears you apart. The second phase introduces that aforementioned status, doing a buff that honestly looks like it's about to be an AoE, and once you know it isn't, would be insanely punishable. The hero puts frost onto her sword. Most of the spins feel similar, albeit with a little more style and additional damage, but the hero also gains more ice spells, areas that build frostbite and chip damage over time, exploding ice trails to cut off the arena. There's just a lot of detail here. Unlike the Crucible Knight, there are no attacks gained that hit insanely hard or out of nowhere. So though the Ancient Hero serves more of a risk than other bosses in the same area, it feels like a fun introduction to a late-game foe, rather than a frustrating exercise. When I finished the Crucible Knight, I was excited to be done. When I finished the hero, I wanted to see more, because I could feel a depth and gaps that I clearly hadn't found. I think the Ancient Hero of Zamor earns a low B grade. Though not astonishing, the two phases in breakneck pace make for a memorable battle that does a great job introducing what later evolves into a glass cannon boss fight. If the ancient hero of Zamor is a glass cannon, then the Cemetery Shade is a piece of straw with a knife and a dream. There are plenty of fast-paced or otherwise agile foes, especially in the late game of Elden Ring, but there is no boss that is more capable of dodging attacks while putting out offense as the Cemetery Shade. Combined with strange delays and a deceptive range, the fight poses a real threat despite the boss's meager constitution. The meat and potatoes of the fight is the Cemetery Shade teleporting through attacks to a new position and releasing a barrage of knife slashes. Though there are patterns here, the timing is incredibly unnatural. Raising the arms to the side for a huge lunge forward, raising one arm to swing up with the other, and speedy barrages followed by incredibly slow strikes means that it's hard to tell exactly what your best defensive option is, especially since they can pull a Father Owl and teleport mid-combo to keep pressure on the player. I try really hard to land jump attacks here, and frankly, that's not the name of the game with the Cemetery Shade. Interestingly, this makes the Cemetery Shade one of the most major variations off the standard boss equation of Elden Ring. Most bosses not only have clear recovery windows or AoE attacks, but landing shield counters and jump attacks reliably lead to staggers for huge damage. The Shade is parryable, so this might be a matter of skills I don't have, but this boss is the one boss in the game that really forces you to test parrying if you want to land that huge recovery moment. In terms of damage, the main threat of the Shade isn't in the damage of the attacks themselves, those blows, at least here, are barely chip damage. The threat here is hemorrhaging. In a single combo, the Shade can fill up your hemorrhage bar and get started on the next one, with the bleed effect in Elden Ring dealing a base 15% of your health plus a then static flat amount. That means that even with an over-leveled health bar, this Shade has the potential to deal lethal damage in a way other bosses can't. It makes a unique design compared to other foes in the game. The Shade also utilizes an infamous attack from Bloodborne, the Brain Sucker's Freeze and Grab. Strangely enough, though it feels intimidating here, I always found this the least threatening attack in the Lone Shade's arsenal. Not only does the rampant teleporting often cause the AI to miss the follow-up, but the damage is bizarrely low. The attack is easier to dodge than it was in Bloodborne and not nearly as spam, so the lack of damage here feels a bit like a mistake. Since the grab is its major ranged threat, it's a strange choice that encourages keeping a distance and taking pot shots. It's hard to judge the Cemetery Shade. It falls incredibly fast, but it's hard to deal damage to, leading to some longer fights on occasion. The speed of Elden Ring isn't a bad thing. The increased pace of the game often makes for fun and frantic moments, but the Cemetery Shade's use of teleports alongside that is a little bit too much. I think it earns a D grade. It's a strange boss for the Weeping Peninsula, too. Maybe it's in this tutorial-focused zone to encourage players to parry, but Elden Ring usually leaves so much to player choice that parrying is only really used by the advanced section of the audience. Even in more demanding and precise fights in the late game, there are always multiple ways to counter the opponent. When the number one strategy on the wiki for a boss is to throw out damage to kill it before you die, it means something's probably a little bit off. I mentioned before that almost every boss in the peninsula feels like they serve as an additional tutorial area, re-cementing core skills as you travel the map to explore before you empower yourself again and travel to the north. Even the harder battles against the Knight's Cavalry or Ancient Heroes still don't get as dangerous as the final bosses of Limgrave or either of the next areas. That is, of course, with the exception of the Weeping Peninsula's Deathbird. This was the first Deathbird I encountered on my blind playthrough, and when I came back to the hill after dying and was unable to find it, I was wondering if it was a boss that would hunt me down. It made me incredibly on edge for a little while. This Deathbird is also a significant upgrade from the Limgrave variant, raising from almost 2800 health to 3900 health. To give you an idea, the final boss, quote-unquote, of the peninsula has just over 2000 health. Though the final boss also feels abnormally frail, it goes to show how much of a wall these Deathbirds really are. With that said, the arena you fight it in is infinitely better. Not only is it less of an assault on your GPU, but the hillside makes for a better area on two fronts. Firstly, though there are still some outcroppings that a player can get stuck on, there are infinitely less in the first encounter. Second, the interactable trees around the edge of the space means it's much easier for the Deathbird to hit them, knocking them down, which creates some great interactivity and weight in the world. Compared to the other Deathbird, who was already fighting uphill to teach a complex and frequently frustrating moveset amid hordes of sheep, trolls, and uneven geometry, this is the kind of straightforward arena that can introduce a boss in a fair way. That is, of course, except for the slope, which can eventually lead to a little bit of weirdness. Maybe without later fights, that first Deathbird would have done worse because I never would have learned the moveset. But this battle, as you've probably noticed by how well it comparatively went, is proof that there is a method to the chaos of the moveset. There are clear windows to react, gaps in the leaps and lunges that the player can punish, and considering how common Deathbirds later become, there are already going to be 2 more in this video alone, this kind of introduction is key to help players really understand the enemy. I think this Deathbird earns a low B grade, and is definitely the better of the first 2 encounters. I also think the Deathbird easily wins the title for the hardest battle in the peninsula. If I hadn't learned its moveset well in the sloppier Limgrave fight, I would not have done nearly as well here. As I mentioned with the Stonedigger Troll, one of the only dungeons marked on all players' maps are the mines, meaning the encounters within these locations are some of, if not the most important, filler battles in the smaller areas. And so, what does the Weeping Peninsula place in your path? That would be the Scaly Misbegotten. This is the second boss in the peninsula that is a buffed version of a mob, but it does not justify itself anywhere near as well as the Rune Bear did. The Rune Bear was intimidating as a mob, feeling almost like a mini-boss you had to avoid. Turning it into a boss forced players to confront it. This is a man with an axe, and he is barely 1 level above the Soldier of Godrick, namely because you can't kill him in 2 hits. You can kill him in 4 or 5. There is so little of interest in this fight. It's not a satisfying enemy to take down, it's not a dangerous or mobile enemy, there's no interesting environment, it's just an elite enemy in a circular room that you've seen before. The most threatening thing it does is somersault towards the player, and it's just boring. This would be an F-grade boss, but I wanted to point out that it's made even worse that the boss of the easiest to find area in a secondary tutorial area is such a complete nothing of an encounter. That said, the next boss on our adventure doesn't really fare much better. Another mob encountered earlier in Limgrave before it turned into a boss here, the Miranda Blossom does, at the very least, pose somewhat of a threat compared to the Scaly Misbegotten. With that said, if you have enough damage, the boss is still barely more than a road bump. I don't have complete time to double check 160 some bosses, but outside of Soldier of Godrick, I think this was the single fastest boss fight in the entire game, taking only 24 seconds to kill. Even with 3 mobs supporting its poison damage, the Blossom has 3 moves. It fills the nearby area with poison, trying to encourage you to move away, calls down beams of light to encourage you to move away, or smashes the ground with its head to encourage you to move away. The issue with all of these attacks is that between them is a ton of open space, where the Blossom barely moves at all. This is a punching bag that does not have the hit points or damage to account for it, which is why it keeps trying to push you away, but it doesn't do a great job. The only thing that the designers seem to take into account for this fight is the arena. Though the area is more restrictive than it is in other similar bosses, it still doesn't make too much of a difference. So long as there's enough space to escape the light beams, which are by far the most dangerous attack, it's easy to move far enough back to heal from poison damage with no real threat. Another F-grade boss, there's just not enough in this moveset to make for an exciting fight. At the very least, however, the Blossom does get the edge on the Misbegotten in atmosphere, though that goes more towards the enemy's visual design than anything else. The final boss of the Weeping Peninsula, as I mentioned, sits in a strange place as far as design goes. On one hand, the boss, as I referenced before, is incredibly fragile, especially if you reach him after doing all of Limgrave and the Peninsula, as I did on this run. The damage dealt and received by this beast feels far too low. On the other hand, that makes the Leonin Misbegotten serve as a perfect capstone for an area designed to welcome in new players. Personally, I like to think of the Leonin Misbegotten in the same way I think of a boss like Taurus Demon. Skippable for experienced players, but for struggling or new players, plunging through Castle Morn and taking the Leonin Misbegotten down can be a huge feeling of accomplishment, especially with how comparatively challenging Stormveil Castle and the bosses within are. Though the Leonin Misbegotten has a bestial design and movements, the attacks are all built around his sword. Honestly, with motions and delays that remind me a little bit of Margit. He uses standard swings from a right-handed sword, delays into spinning attacks, uses jumping attacks that create dynamic camera angles if you're locked on, and similarly has an arena that, if you run away too much, has a cliff edge rather than a wall. Of course, he lacks the health, the second phase, the damage output, and the interrupt potential, but the skills that the Leonin Misbegotten teaches are all specifically called to again in that Margit fight. Unlike other bosses within the peninsula, the Leonin Misbegotten is a great enemy. There's an achievement for its completion, but unlike other great enemies, there's nothing of real importance here. There's no key to unlock a path to one of the bosses, there's no path to open, just a nice sword that the player can choose to use. And every Limgrave Misbegotten in the game usually drops a sword, so it isn't even unique in that regard. The Weeping Peninsula as an area does not carry nearly the punch Limgrave does, but I think the Limgrave Misbegotten is proof as to why. To a new or struggling player, this is the culmination of an area designed to teach you and re-cement the tempo of Elden Ring in its attacks, a chance to gain a few levels and a few new options for weapons, and get that sense of accomplishment as you officially clear your first dungeon and see that achievement pop. The region lock of the run that I did here makes this boss look worse than it is. When you think of this boss as another potential lesson culminating a tutorial area, it justifies its own existence brilliantly. And though it and its moveset are nothing incredible, it fulfills its role in an open-world game as the boss behind enough obstacles to be a challenge, but not so many as to be a threat. Personally, I think the Limgrave Misbegotten just edges his way into the A grade. Elden Ring wants to come out of the gate swinging full force, and it's areas like the Peninsula and bosses like the Limgrave Misbegotten that help make sure that, no matter what the skill level of the player, there's still an early challenge to overcome. There are a lot of bosses in Liurnia. The area is absolutely massive, even compared to Limgrave. Unlike Limgrave, however, the path to take to explore is also much more scattered. In Limgrave, there were 3 clear paths, one south to the easier peninsula, one east to the much harder Caelid, which isn't even making it into this first video, or pushing your way towards Stormvale Castle, and with it, the battles with Margit and Godrick. Liurnia, meanwhile, is built around its dungeon, encircling it with encounters. And because of this, it's also where it becomes incredibly clear that Elden Ring is not built for an all-bosses run. This may seem like a pedantic place to start this. After all, the Knight's Cavalry in the south of Liurnia is a proof of the area's more lethal nature. Though the moveset here is identical to Limgrave's glaive-wielding variant, the damage in Liurnia starts to demand the player's respect immediately. Before, I could easily trade hits with the Cavalry, but now, a single hit and side check are enough to put me under half health. Godrick very much stands out as the wall out of the early game, though some might still classify Liurnia in that section. The training wheels have certainly come off. And with the damage raised up, the threat of the Knight's Cavalry is a lot more noticeable, though it does still linger behind the Deathbird. It follows up attacks with a stomp or side check incredibly quickly, and the Cavalry's biggest strength starts to be revealed here as a weakness. When it spends so much time moving away from the player, it's easy to find moments to heal and prepare for their return, which can turn the fight into a bit of a damage test more than anything. Will you take the Cavalry down before you run out of supplies? The arena here in particular is amazing. The player has 2 options when they arrive in Liurnia. Move through the dangerous swamp or travel along one of its edges through the forest. And when they move back down towards the swamp from that forest, this Knight's Cavalry is waiting for those players who were too afraid to face Liurnia's challenge head-on. And plunging back down towards the center of the swamp from within that forest, the Knight's Cavalry ambushes you on a tight road covered with thick trees and few light sources, catching players who were too afraid to face Liurnia's challenge head-on. I slightly alluded to this before, but this is the footage that proves it. Sometimes, when you knock a Knight's Cavalry off their horse, they'll summon the horse back so quickly that the entire excitement of a double moveset ends up falling flat. Which again is a shame, because they make for solid foes on and off this horse. The Knight's Cavalry in southern Liurnia, by the Gate Town Bridge, earns a low B grade. It finally delivers on that atmosphere that this enemy needed, as it tucks the battle away in one of the easier to find dark corners of the far more dangerous Liurnia. Another rematch that lacks much definition outside of heightened stats, Liurnia's first Erdtree avatar doesn't do anything too differently than the first battle in the Weeping Peninsula. Again though, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. The Weeping Peninsula and Liurnia are in fully different directions, and with nothing pointing the player to the south, this can easily be the first encounter with one of the avatars for a player. And even if not, the damage has leapt up enough to be a unique threat. Already pushing 5,000 health, the durability of the mid-game does a great job making this avatar require learning and respecting its moveset, especially compared to earlier foes. From this footage, it seems pretty easy, but even with a tanky build, a single solid hit from this thing brought me down to half my health. Since there's not much I have to say on this specific avatar, I should probably mention why there are so many of them and why I give them a little bit of leeway. The Erdtree avatars universally drop the tiers that adjust and improve your physic. Because of this, every avatar means another opportunity to improve one of the easiest to change and adjust tools from fight to fight, meaning these rematches become a lot more exciting, as they not only promise new tools, but new tools that will almost always be helpful or allow for new builds. If you have your weapon in an Ash of War you like, a lot of other boss weapons can feel underwhelming, and the Spirit Ashes are mechanics some people don't even like to use. The physic, however, is always exciting, and it goes a long way towards making these similar fights feel worth constantly facing. I think the Erdtree avatar in Southwest Liurnia earns another B grade, getting the slight edge on the peninsula. Being higher leveled, it's harder to overwhelm the fight, and especially in a fight against a straightforward enemy like the Avatar, not being able to overwhelm it keeps the fight from ever feeling too easy. The first Liurnia boss, who will not be appearing again in this video, is an Erdtree burial Watchdog. Unlike the variation in the Impaler's catacombs in the peninsula, this Erdtree burial Watchdog is a far better rematch for the player. Though it's a far more fragile boss than some of his fellows in Liurnia, the health here has doubled what it used to be in Limgrave, which is at least enough to pose a threat early in this area. The damage is higher, which is good, but the biggest reason why this Watchdog stands out is the variation on moveset. Boasting the peninsula's three-headed design for the Fire Breath, it also wields a staff over a sword. Considering the theme of Liurnia is very clearly magic, it makes this boss feel a lot more distinct. When bosses are rematched so frequently, things like this really make them feel like they belong in the area. On top of that, the additional ranged threat provided, being a selection of homing soul mass spells, covers some of the biggest weaknesses of the Watchdog's more melee-focused moveset, particularly with how slow it often is to close the distance. With the mobs removed again, the movements of the Watchdog are back in focus as well, letting it feel uncanny and exciting. Now, I'm not 100% certain on this, but there seem to be less of the delays and spins that could occasionally make the sword variation feel unnatural to fight. The uncanny movements and walking attack do persist, but slams stop after a single hit, and the lack of a spin means the fight's tempo doesn't get thrown off nearly as much. Like the first Erdtree burial Watchdog, I think this one earns another B grade, working a little better overall. Though it lacks the excitement of seeing the bizarre design for the first time that the first likely had, the moveset is far less frustrating, more threatening at more ranges, and fits in with the area it rests in more than most bosses in this game usually bother to try. Unlike all the bosses that came before, the Deathbird is back with another vengeance in what is by far its best showing yet. Though the Peninsula Deathbird had taken a huge step up in terms of arena from Limgrave, the atmosphere of Liurnia's empty sky over the dimly lit marsh covered with lights makes for a great setting against this nighttime predator. There is no terrain for the player to get stuck on, and not a single slope for the Deathbird to be at a significant height difference from the player. For many attacks, that of course doesn't matter, but the Deathbird's hardest to dodge moves are his delayed downward thrusts and slams, attacks that will take longer to connect based on the vertical difference between the bird and the player. With the ground finally leveled, there is a consistency to this fight that the previous Deathbirds both lacked. And with that gone, once you know how to fight a Deathbird, this encounter is the first one that really clicks in a super exciting way. Halfway through this battle, I only had a single flask left to heal, and I thought I was doomed. Somehow, I made it out alive, because the usually scattered timing of these birds finally clicked. This is the second to last Deathbird in the game, but we'll be seeing the Deathbird moveset plenty more. This encounter earns a high B grade. Seeing it here, in an ambiance that the design excels in an arena that doesn't make the timing feel abnormal or unfair, makes it really shine. It's been a while in this video since there's been some good footage of me dying to my own stupidity, but the Omen Killer was one of the only bosses in this first video that got a couple solid deaths out of me this playthrough. Omen Killer is a strange boss. He seems simpler than other bosses in the game, and is usually found as a mob. Here though, he and his two dogs are able to put up a decent fight, in no small part because of an absolutely brutal amount of damage he can do on his leaping attack. It took me a while to understand why this specific mob was uniquely promoted to boss in such a strange arena with those two dogs, and then it hit me right as I was being obliterated. This is the Capra Demon, but it's working now. Like the Capra Demon, the Omen Killer of course has two dogs. However, not only are the dogs in Elden Ring much better than they were back in Dark Souls, with clearer attack animations and more health, the open nature of the arena also means you can sneak around to try to get rid of them before they become a problem. meaning a chance for a player to learn from a death encounter attack, rather than just a crapshoot every run. The moveset here is also a huge glow-up from the Capra Demon. Honestly, even more than the Erdtree avatar. The Capra Demon's attacks were incredibly straightforward. A single slam, a spin to attack behind them, and then a few swings with his single weapon. The Omen Killer uses all those basic swings to leave him open, but he has variations too. Swings that come out incredibly quickly, or swings that will take a while to connect. However, none of the timing is delayed enough to feel unnatural. Just delayed enough that you can't blindly roll through everything in the way you could with Capra Demon. In addition to a heavy swing to turn in place, the Omen Killers also gain a Fire Breath attack. Though the damage isn't too significant, it does force distance between him and the player, which lets the Omen Killer use his most powerful leaps into combat, by far his most dangerous moves, again. And getting to those leaps, he now hits them 3 times in a row instead of once, and it's very easy to get taken from full health to dead from this barrage of attacks. However, unlike the Erdtree Burial Watchdog, these come out absurdly fast. Waiting for the 3 attacks to end may take a moment, yes, but the fight certainly doesn't come to a halt in the way it did with the Watchdog. Usually, you'll either time all of these rolls, or you'll time none of them. It provides a great threat, especially when combined with the dogs. If you spend too much focus on the dogs, it's easy to get blindsided by the jumping attacks, and when you're surrounded, escaping the attack is much easier said than done. It does mean that Omen Killer does still have some overwhelming deaths, yes, but it uses the threat of a straightforward and exciting attack rather than just putting you in a box that the camera can't keep up with. This may seem strangely high for a mob turn boss, but Omen Killer took a fight I loathed and made it work. It deserves a high B grade and should be placed on the mantle as a well-earned trophy. Also, points here for a unique arena. Not many non-remembrance bosses can boast that. Outside of the Everjail in Limgrave, the first real boss encounter against a Crucible Knight is against the Spear variant, and wait a minute, that's not a snail? That's right, our true foe here is in the light, not even revealed by proximity. Attack that light, however, and the incredibly squishy snail is revealed. It can teleport away, but finishing the battle is as easy as running after and landing a few more attacks. The Crucible Knight does follow after you, and it can technically be killed, but if it dies, it just ends up being resummoned a moment later. Especially considering most of the Crucible Knight's mobility doesn't become threatening until their second phase, that means this snail has a pretty pathetic guardian. Often, the snail will teleport before the Crucible Knight has the chance to really intervene. There are 2 Spirit Caller snails in Elden Ring, and they both tackle this concept in a unique way. I'll get into the other design concept later, but this way is unfortunately not it. There's not a real threat here, and the only real excitement to be had was putting together that the boss behind the illusions in the dungeons was, in fact, creating those illusions. It works in the world and makes the dungeon memorable, but it's not a memorable fight. The first Spirit Caller snail just slides into D grade. I was going to use a verb to describe how the snail went into the D grade, but there isn't a specific verb for, and I quote directly from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, deforming the layer of mucus beneath it via muscular contractions in its foot muscle. Today I learned. But returning to the Everjails, instead of an elite endgame enemy, we finally get an NPC, specifically a pyromancer with a flick mace. Adon, the Thief of Fire, is doing hard time in the Everjail for fire theft, and he's got a couple of tricks in his moveset. Outside of some standard NPC attacks using the short-range mace, Adon has 3 big tricks. Firstly, he does utilize a little pyromancy, doing both a short-ranged combustion burst and summoning a large orb that's fairly dangerous to contend with. It works a little differently, but this orb ends up being used far, far later in the game by the Fire Giant. Of course, it's also the spell you unlock here, and I've not actually done enough magic in this game to know how effective it really is, but it certainly puts on good pressure in a player versus player situation. Second, he has an Art of War on his flick mace, where he spins it around him for a while before doing a huge jump attack and slamming down. This may be a hard move to challenge, but it is an incredibly easy move to dodge. Especially compared to the far more engaging Pyromancy orb, it's a bit of a disappointing move. Finally, he's got his own healing flask, but it only has a single charge on it for 25% of his health bar, which is not much, considering how frail he is. Adon isn't a bad fight, of course. It doesn't fall into the same frustrating traps that some NPC fights can fall into, but it also doesn't do anything particularly exciting. It earns a D grade. The Flame Orb is easily the highlight here in a big way, and a moveset entirely built around slow-moving projectiles seems like a fun idea. But the moveset here can't close the distance enough to stop the best solution to these kind of attacks: walking away and waiting for him to finish. As I mentioned, Liurnia sits right in that point between the early and mid-game of Elden Ring, and one of the biggest proofs of that is that there are still some occasional bosses introducing what will later become standard mobs, and the Cleanrot Knight is one of the last one-on-one fights that does this kind of introduction. With that said, the Cleanrot Knight, especially in this arena, definitely feels less straightforward than battles previous, like the Beastman of Farum Azula. Getting through the Stillwater Cave is designed to wear out the player's resources. Almost constant, unavoidable poison in a dark space and tanky enemies means that the player would likely have run low on healing by the time they first reach the Cleanrot Knight, and the Cleanrot Knight has a few tricks up his sleeve to abuse this. First, the arena is mostly poison, making that condition hard to get rid of. On top of that, baiting the knight onto the ground proper is much easier said than done, as the knight not only has a habit of leaping backwards out of combat, but also using a spear summoning attack, a little reminiscent of Half-Light, and a lunging attack. The lunging attack in particular is a grab, and if it hits, then Scarlet Rot gets added on top of the poison. On top of that, the knight loves to enter a parry state, and though sometimes attacks go through without an issue, sometimes your attack will be deflected, pushing back damage and a knockdown. Now, I'm not against parry moves in general. In games like Hollow Knight, they're a key component of checking the player's aggression and rewarding observation, while also having a high skill reaction if you activate the parry. I might just not understand the mechanics behind this particular one, but it feels like it just puts a pause on the battle. The Cleanrot Knight being defensive does work well with its gimmick. With poison and potentially Scarlet Rot on the player will be trying to rush, and the knight is trying to make you burn away. The method it uses doesn't always feel satisfying. I wish that there was more focus on the knight's mobility and ranged capability rather than just being defensive. Whenever they leap back and start flinging out that improved spear attack, it makes the arena feel very dynamic as you weave around and into a jump or other heavy attack. The openings all of the attacks create mean it is always worth keeping your poison damage ticking, because if you're able to keep your mobility up, you can keep your aggression high. Overall, I think the Cleanrot Knight does deserve a low C grade. I like the moveset and concept of the boss and arena, particularly since poison is so much less deadly in Elden Ring, but the parry does lead to a little bit of boredom. Even then, Cleanrot Knight is a great final use of a single late-game mob as a boss fight. The rematch with the Bloodhound Knight is a strange fight. It loses the specific name Darriwil had, but outside of that initially seems identical. The damage and health is of course scaled up, but the core of the fight being against an easily staggered and fragile enemy with fast damaging attacks that build bleed quickly remains. For some reason though, the fight felt so much faster even when attacks were frame identical, and that speed made the boss feel overwhelmingly demanding. It took me a long time watching the two fights back to back to figure out exactly what was different between the two fights, but once I noticed it, the rematch became a lot easier to handle. Darriwil would constantly utilize this dash forward smoke attack, pause for a moment, and then usually used a horizontal swings to open a combo. Outside of a sword dragging attack, this is the most common way he closed the distance. And with how frequently he dashed or spun back, that means players will see this attack pretty frequently. The Bloodhound Knight here changes that specific move. The pause, where Darriwil braced himself before attacking, is gone. Instead, it just goes directly into the swing, occasionally with a small delay that Darriwil uses as his faster variation of the attack. With this, the entire fight has sped up. Previously, Darriwil may have been moving quickly, but you were still reacting to the attacks as they came. Now, you need to be ready to dodge the movement itself, as the movement will be tied into the attack, taking away that moment you usually have to analyze what's coming next. Personally, I think the moveset was already fast-paced enough. When I started rewatching the footage here, I never realized how comparatively long Darriwil waits before attacking, but I did feel how fast this knight would move. I wish, rather than increase the speed on this smoke dash, that the knight had some more health, damage, or other unique moves to close the gap, but that's nitpicking and dreaming. The Bloodhound Knight still earns a high C grade. Though the simple moveset does struggle to remain complex enough to be deeply satisfying, it's still a fun boss to nail down and land those huge hits on. Things like that can make the player feel very powerful, even if they're still at risk. When you add a mob to a boss fight, you are walking a dangerous line. If the boss isn't aggressive enough, adding mobs just means you have something to beat before you're able to do the boss proper. But if the boss is too aggressive, dealing with the mobs becomes frustratingly difficult, especially when the complexity of those mobs increases. The battle with the Cemetery Shade in the Black Knife Catacombs features not only an enhanced version of the enemy with a much higher base damage, but 3 skeleton mobs, 2 with swords and 1 with a bow. Anyone who's watched this series thus far knows that I'm probably not the biggest fan of fights against multiple enemies, which Elden Ring likes to utilize. Sometimes they do a pretty solid job, but fights like this are where Elden Ring misses the mark. The skeletons and Shade all move quickly, having multiple attacks that close a significant distance. The skeletons will shoot themselves forward while you're doing something else, and grabs and teleports from the Shade can get frustrating fast. The grab in particular swaps from a not particularly lethal attack to a massive roll of the dice. When you're frozen but not yet grabbed, you can still take damage. So if the skeletons decide now they're going to go full aggressive, the grab can be an instant death even before the Shade decides if it's even thinking of following up. On top of that, the visibility in this arena is not great. The Shade's arena is intentionally dark, the same trick that was used with the Black Knife Assassin back in Limgrave. However, in this case, it also means that the skeletons absolutely do not pop. It's incredibly easy for them to just blend into the background here. That is, except for when they're regenerating, which is by far the most frustrating mechanic within this fight. The way skeletons work in Elden Ring is that once they die, their ribcage will fall onto the ground. After a few moments, those bones begin to glow. You need to land another hit, or that skeleton will reanimate at full health. The issue is that standing in one place and waiting while you're being shot at and followed by multiple enemies is not a great feeling. Sometimes the Shade has no problem letting you kill the skeleton with time to spare. Other times, the AI will decide that the Shade has gone fully aggressive, and outside of deciding to eat a combo, which is potential death, you're not going to kill that skeleton. One final bizarre design decision is that the health of these enemies is really off-kilter. 2 hits on the archer here dealt about 1/3 of its health. So knowing that, how much do you think a single jump attack would do to the boss? If you answered half of its health bar, congratulations! I don't know why the health is balanced this way. For the second time here, the best way to deal with the Cemetery Shade is not to play the game. Rush it down with damage and bypass the irritation entirely. Unlike the first though, what you're bypassing is far more frustrating rather than just utilizing numbers to your advantage against the boss. I think this particular Cemetery Shade is the first non-mob boss fight to earn an F grade. It's not fun, and it makes the boss's design feel sloppier. After a few deaths, you'd think this victory would feel satisfying, but just 4 hits skipping this encounter feels so cheap. Finally boasting a full health bar, we get the first reappearance of the Black Knife Assassin, giving us a first real look at this reoccurring boss that later turns into an enemy. And whereas the Cemetery Shade very much felt like a too-fast boss that struggled to find its footing, the Black Knife Assassins are one of my favorite battles. Even without the twist of starting at partial health, the fight still holds up as a boss. Most of the moveset works just as well as it did in Limgrave. The restrictive arena keeps the assassin in close, keeping the dodges from ever feeling too frustrating, while also making sure that the player is forced to engage with the barrage of slices, kicks, and slams. There's just enough of a pause between the assassin's attacks for a counterattack, while still keeping up this feeling of constant aggression. And for heavier builds, attacks like the spin and grab leave large enough windows to start forcing the assassin in a corner. One fun detail here is that this Black Knife is a hidden boss within an already optional dungeon. The Cemetery Shade is the true boss of this area, but if you run up onto a blade, you can find where this Black Knife has made a base. It's a really fun discovery to make, and it keeps the Black Knives feeling dangerous and rare even after 2 occurrences. With a more endurant health bar, we also get our first real look here at one of Elden Ring's more brutal mechanics, Destined Death. Well, I call it Destined Death, I don't actually know what it's called. But it's this red fire thing that, when it hits you, deals damage to your max health in addition to its usual damage, and this decrease of health lasts for a long while. Especially with the assassin's aggression, waiting it out isn't very much of an option. Damage here is still low overall, keeping it from getting too frustrating, but the assassin making up for its lower damage by decreasing your health on certain attacks is a really fun idea. Putting a limit on how much you can heal back up means that, once the assassin has the upper hand, there's only so safe you can ever really be. The Black Knife Assassin here earns a B grade. I really enjoy these enemies, and both the boss encounters so far are excellent showings of what makes them so good. The Knight's Cavalry on the northern side of Liurnia is not just a rematched boss, it is an identical fight. The damage balance here is identical. Each of the cavalry do the same damage and have exactly 2,704 hit points. Not 2,705, 2,704 each. Each of them provide 5,600 runes, and their only variation is a different Ash of War and a different location. This location, unfortunately, doesn't do quite as well as the prior Knight's Cavalry. It's still a solid arena here, don't get me wrong, but the ruins just outside the academy don't compare to the cinematic crevice on the dark road to the swamp proper. With that said, it's still the same solid boss, earning another B grade. There are a lot of Knight's Cavalry, especially here, in the hopes you'll encounter at least one as you explore Liurnia, so it makes sense to have at least a couple fully identical bosses. It just proves that I am probably playing this game wrong right now, because hitting the cavalry and hitting other bosses like a checklist is not intended. As I mentioned earlier, I think the Tibia Mariner should have been a nighttime encounter, and I don't think there's a Tibia Mariner that proves that point better than the battle in Liurnia. There are 3 portions of the Mariner's space that he can teleport to. The best is within the shade of the forest. You've got an atmospheric swamp, it's dark, and the design pops out really well. The second is in the swamp outside the forest. That space is open with a few trees and ruins. It doesn't do anything incredible, but it's not as bad as the third space, a grassy hill in the broad daylight. The Mariner is almost aggressively unatmospheric here. The water effects look wrong on the grassy hill, and the light it gives off feels washed out in the sunlight instead of ethereal. It just completely stops working. The first Mariner introduced the enemy, and each of the next 2 versions will add something new, but this is the only encounter that does not add anything, outside of maybe some slightly tougher skeletons, which of course will do nothing but force you to run a couple more loops as you whittle down the Mariner from the safety of Torrent's back. I don't think it earns an F grade, but this Mariner is right on the edge with a D grade. With no exciting gameplay developments and no atmosphere, this Mariner just is not cut out even to match the other underwhelming fight. Like the Knight's Cavalry, the Erdtree avatars in Liurnia are similarly mechanical duplicates, being distinguished only by their arenas, and this avatar has, by far, the best early game atmosphere of the 3. All the avatars are fought by, fittingly, minor Erdtrees, and these huge trees serve as the center obstacle around the arena. Though everything around the areas are fairly similar, usually flat space with large pots that can be broken with a roll or a dash from Torrent, only the third one makes use of one of the key design points of the entire overworld of Elden Ring, the glowing Erdtree in the background. For this Erdtree avatar, as you reach the bluff it's on, it lines up with the Erdtree being almost directly behind the avatar and the tree just offset enough to be able to be a gorgeous vista. It's a small detail, but it adds a lot to this fight and ties the larger tree in with the tree that's creating this avatar. Beyond that, there's not much else to say beyond that it's another B-grade fight. The next time we'll see the Erdtree avatar, the moveset will have evolved, but this first trio makes for some great, easily accessible fights that boost the options your physic offers. After I beat the first bell-bearing hunter a little underleveled in the first area, I figured that, being part of the way done with Liurnia, I'd be able to take the next bell-bearing hunter with not too much of an issue. It turns out that he scales very well. Appearing in the Temple of the Dog Priest at nighttime, the Church of Vows bell-bearing hunter is mechanically just as superb as his first iteration, though his atmosphere lingers a little behind. Liurnia is far better lit at night than Limgrave is, meaning the red of the sword doesn't stick out nearly as well, especially since the church's roof is open to the stars. That light works great for the Deathbird and making it unsettling, it does not work quite as well with this lighting. Unlike the first shop he ambushed, which was a worn-down wooden shack, the Church of Vows, despite being destroyed, carries a weight other areas lack. In Limgrave, the bell-bearing hunter felt like it was clawing in through the refuse of the world to hunt you down. But here, it just feels like you're casting the bell-bearing hunter out of a place it shouldn't be. It feels a lot more like a classic boss fight than like the hunter should feel. A hunter finding you outside of an arena. With that said, the gameplay here is still great, as it's a near pitch-perfect recreation of that first one. I think this instance of the hunter earns a high B grade. Solid and exciting, but not nearly as uncanny as that first entrance. I've referenced before that the core loop of Elden Ring combat is not in damage in the way it was prior. Now it is focused on utilizing stance-breaking attacks on opponents that will land a visceral, taking the tempo of often incredibly fast fights back. There are no bosses that is more true for than the Crystallian enemies, though they frankly go a little too far in that direction. When the battle begins, the Crystallians have so much defense that they seem invincible. They can't be staggered, and it's frankly intimidating, until you've broken their stance. Once that happens, the Crystallian is effectively dead. They start taking a huge amount of damage and stagger to even the lightest hit, meaning just 1 or 2 bars of stamina use are usually enough to finish whatever's left of the battle. Their movesets are also incredibly simple, long windups for attacks that rarely lead into combos. The Ringblade version introduced here does have some ranged threat that I do love. Thrown blades that circle around and in on the player rather than right at them feel great to dodge, and the blade being thrown forward and returning back like a hula hoop makes for a fun lingering threat hitbox. A few variations on top of that, like the blade drawing a semicircle, feel great, or they would feel great if you ever saw them use it. There's also an attack where it spins violently for a few moments while moving towards the player, forcing them to reposition before leaping back in to punish with either a heavy strike or jump attack. But again, that's assuming any of these unique attacks get the chance to be used. This fight is over before it's ever really begun. The stance breaks with only a couple of hits, and then there's absolutely nothing the Crystallian can do to stop you. The fight doesn't develop here, it just ends. This Crystallian earns a D grade. I think the Crystallians did have a place as bosses in Elden Ring, but the single fights against them belong in Limgrave, not Liurnia. The simple movesets and focus on teaching and enforcing such a core mechanic feels much better suited for the start of the game, rather than almost 50 bosses into the list. The Deathbirds were one of the most threatening mini-bosses in the early game. With aggressive movesets, high damage, a solid defense, and a hard-to-predict weak spot, combined with a higher-than-average health pool for their respective areas, they made traveling at nighttime an often threatening experience, especially for a new player. As we reach the end of Liurnia, though, we learn that they were also a tutorial, a weakened version of the real encounter. The Death-Right birds take everything dangerous and difficult about the Deathbirds and amp it up to 11. There are more hit points, they're even more aggressive, they do more damage per hit, they have more moves, and on top of that, the Death-Right bird starts to add after effects to each of the moves. Fire trails and explosive AoEs that the player needs to avoid in what used to be safe moments to attack. It also gains a spell that creates homing missiles that overlap with the bird's next attack, making it even harder to find a way to dodge in and respond with any damage to the absolute truck of a health bar. And because all of that alone wasn't enough, attacks from the Death-Right bird also inflict Frostbite, which not only takes a chunk of your health when it triggers, but makes you take even more damage every time you get hit. A lot of bosses will slowly increase the threat they provide each time you encounter them in the overworld. Meanwhile, the Death-Right birds assume at this point you've probably mastered the basics and you're ready to be dropped in the deep end. This enemy is so aggressive and demanding that the version appearing in the final area is sometimes considered one of the single toughest enemies in the game. If the Deathbirds made traveling at night risky, the Death-Right birds make it absolutely terrifying, especially with the visual design and presence those wings give. With all of that said, and every challenge laid out, I think I like the Death-Right birds way more than I have any right to. This one in particular is such a massive difficulty spike. Even compared to Renala at the end of the area, this is probably the single hardest fight in part 1 of this series. But when you finally start to find the gaps on this bird, when you finally start to manage to put up a fight, it feels so ridiculously satisfying. The atmosphere and terrain that the Liurnia Deathbird used works just as well in the Death-Right bird, though the two fights do overlap a bit more than I'd personally like. Obviously, the first Deathbird was still in preparation for this one, but it's a shame to get the birds in such similar arenas. One final compliment to end on, however, is that despite how much mobility this boss requires as you run and avoid the flaming ground, I have never once seen another enemy come close to joining the fray. Though the placement on the map may seem haphazard, this proves how intentional it truly was. Considering Elden Ring's affinity for multiple threats at a time, the designers knew that the Death-Right bird cannot be a foe that you multitask for. It demands your complete and utter attention, and I love that the game made sure to place them somewhere that allowed that. The first Death-Right bird earns a B grade. Now that might seem low with how much I'm gushing about it, but there are still frustrations to be found, as the bird leaps or occasionally proves frustrating as it executes a move after move that the player cannot punish. Despite this, it remains an incredible nighttime boss, making players truly fear the potential darkness and what it can mean from this point forward. As we finally draw close to the end of Liurnia's massive horde of foes, we get to look at a few more Evergaols. The first of which is the Onyx Lord. Armed with a sword, the warrior's design is actually a little misleading. This is a mage, first and foremost, with only a few melee attacks to provide a little close-range threat once you get in. Most of the magic utilized by the Onyx Lord is gravity magic. Projectiles that will change speed mid-air as they hone towards the player, slowdown effects, pushback effects, or summoning meteors from a portal after a surprisingly low damage AoE. That comment right there holds the big issue with the fight. The spells he uses look impressive and imposing, but they deal so little damage. I take 3 spells and 2 meteors to the face here, and I'm still able to undo almost all of it with a single flask usage. These attacks command so little respect here, especially since this is the Evergaols introducing what will later become a boss. The Crucible Knight demanded you respect his attacks. The Ancient Hero demanded that you play defensively and find your moments to attack. The Onyx Lord is a punching bag that can push you away, forcing you to maybe spend a little stamina to run towards him. It's a disappointing battle compared to the rest. I wish that the Evergaols had a tighter theme. Are they all supposed to be characters like Darriwil, Aiden, and Bowles? Or are they overpowered enemies like the Crucible Knight? Or are they just basic enemies with no real upgrade, or other bosses like the Onyx Lord or the Ancient Hero of Zamor? This fight confuses the identity even more than it already was. The Onyx Lord earns a D grade. Like a lot of things in this grade, it's not insulting or broken, but it doesn't persist in any meaningful way in the player's mind or lead to creating any patterns to discover in the overworld. A lot of elite enemies in Elden Ring will often find themselves promoted with a health boost into a boss encounter. The trolls in Limgrave end up as 3 unique boss fights over the course of the game. The best of these bosses is the Evergaol battle against Bowles, Carrion Knight, namely because this isn't just a troll. Bowles is an armored troll wearing a long cape wielding a magical sword that allows him to summon magical daggers. The base of the moveset stays the same here, albeit with less stomps and area of effects and more focused on ranged attacks. Unfortunately, that also means the weaknesses remain the same. Bowles is incredibly exploitable as an enemy, especially considering how little defense he has. With just over 5,000 health, you'd think that he could take a beating, but trolls are so easy to knock down and take so much time to stand back up that it's incredibly easy to outdamage Bowles. And the player shouldn't be able to outdamage a 20-foot tall warrior mage. Like the other trolls, he does have a roar that increases his damage by around 20% for 15 seconds, but that feels just too little too late. The roar leaves him wide open to land more jump attacks, meaning even with lighter weapons, it won't take much more to knock him back into his long fall down and standing animation, usually wasting the time of his damage boost. With that said and done, Bowles has so much more character than the other trolls. The magic attack may lack threat, but combined with the size and physical force the trolls usually rely upon, it makes for a memorable encounter. And again, even something as small as a name can make a reskin feel more special. Just edging above the Stonedigger troll, Bowles the Carrion Knight just edges into the C grade. It lacks a lot compared to other fights, but there's something satisfying about walking up to the rift expecting another human-sized foe and watching your camera crane up to make space for him. There are a lot of arguments made that Elden Ring makes enemies too fast compared to the rest of the game and From Software's library, that players aren't given the proper moments to counterattack, complaints that attacks deal too much damage too fast or otherwise are designed with fun and interactivity as a second priority to cinematic effect. For the most part, I disagree with a large number of these complaints. Elden Ring uses fast attacks sparingly, often to make the player feel panicked or trapped somewhere. But those designs do leave gaps that can be found. One exception to this rule, however, is the Royal Revenant. I have yet to meet anyone who enjoys fighting the Royal Revenants. I've talked with some people who enjoy the panic they can cause as an enemy, but other enemies such as the Deathrite Bird or Morgott display a much more effective use of hectic and often hard to read movesets with rapid follow-ups. Not only does the Royal Revenant attack wildly and without warning from all the various limbs on its body, but it has strange delays with lunges that lead into long combos of attacks that can shred a player's health bar. On top of that, the Revenant has a poison breath that cuts off half the arena, enough range to reach you in an instant, and, as the cherry on top, the ability to teleport mid-attack, making an already awkward or delayed timing even more difficult to land. Now, there was a counterplay designed for this specific enemy, one that you do not see me utilize in this footage. If you use healing magic on it, it takes damage. Now, I haven't done this myself, but according to a wiki, any heal does a base 50% of the Revenant's health bar. To my knowledge, there is no other boss in Elden Ring with such a massively exploitable weakness that victory can be achieved by using a completely unleveled move twice. Of course, this is assuming that the player thinks to use healing, which has not worked on any Flesh Warp-esque creations like the Grafted Scion or Godrick. It's only the Royal Revenant. Though I love the idea of a creature weak to healing, there's nothing immediately communicating it, and healing magic is not that commonly used, at least from my friends who've played the game. The fight as a whole is so frustrating. The closest thing to a satisfying move to dodge is the slam, which is always followed up with a second slam and then swapping immediately back to melee. The Revenant clips into walls and attacks so fast with attacks that vary in threat so wildly that you never know what the punishment for being hit will actually be. I think the Royal Revenant is the first elite or otherwise boss enemy who, in a one-on-one fight, earns an F grade. Other F grades are often mobs that weren't fit, or bosses ruined by gimmicks within the battle, but the Royal Revenant is just not a fun enemy to fight. There are a lot of great enemies that are rematched in Elden Ring. Margit will later evolve into Morgott, and Mohg later unlocks a second phase and provides context when you find him again. Things like that. Usually, there's a clear reason as to why they reappear, or in the case of Mohg and Morgott, why they appear before their fight. One of the only fights that I still don't quite understand the existence of is the Royal Knight Loretta. Loretta appears twice as a boss encounter, once here in a spectral form and once as one of the last bosses in the game. And when I mean last bosses, I mean one of the last 10 bosses that will be discussed in a series of over 160 bosses. Loretta is in the endgame with a capital E. This early game version is immune to all status effects, whereas the endgame foe can be affected. Other than that, the movesets are functionally identical. Sure, Loretta gets a few attacks earlier than her spirit variant here, but only gets a single enhancement to her magical bow. Otherwise, they are the same. Though her lore makes sense, it makes the use of her here a strange design choice, as it means that upon exploring one of the final hidden areas of the game, you'll run into a version of a boss you've already learned to fight, now with more weaknesses. Loretta as a boss is an evolution of the Tree Sentinel, losing some of the magical defense and replacing it with magic of her own, which is ridiculously fun. It takes the already complete Tree Sentinel boss fight and develops it even further, which is a great way that Elden Ring approaches boss design. But when the improvements to the moveset appear this early in the game, it makes the Royal Knight Loretta seem out of place. Her existence means stepping back down to the Tree Sentinels afterward is awkward as you're decreasing the challenge. And for me, it took away from the battle with Loretta upon the Haligtree later in the game because I already knew everything that she could do. It might seem a bit backwards to not go too much into depth on the moveset of Loretta yet. I'm going to save that for when we face the final version. But for this, I mostly wanted to talk about how strange she feels this early and question why her moveset is, to put it bizarrely, so complete. Because however much I run over this fight, I can't find a good gameplay reason as to why Loretta would be put in the game earlier as a potentially required boss for some endings. I'm going to give Loretta a spot right near the top of the B grade. She would earn a higher grade for gameplay, but her role as an encounter feels too confused for me to give her anything higher. After all, once you've met the real Loretta, the Royal Knight just feels lesser. When we encountered our first Crystallian earlier in Liurnia, I mentioned that the solo enemy is too simple for this area. As a duo fight, however, they do put up a bit more of an interesting battle, though it reveals a few other faults within their design. This duo fight doesn't utilize the Ringblade version of the foe we saw earlier, instead introducing both the spear and mage variations. The spear variation does have a moveset, but will only use one of those moves, hopping forward with a stab 4 or 5 times before landing with a particularly heavy lunge. Though often frustrating to dodge, the moveset actually works really well in a duo fight. It's simple enough to be predictable, leaves a window to counterattack, and still puts up enough of a threat that you do have to be aware of and move around it. The mage, however, drops the ball really hard here, leaving a lot more to be desired. The moveset is fine in a vacuum. A long charge blast or a quick shotgun directly in front of it, as well as a spinning get off me move. And, of course, his favorite, standing and doing absolutely nothing. Crystallians in general are not particularly aggressive foes, but just look at this. He doesn't even care. I'm killing his buddy right in front of him, and he's just slowly walking towards me. You're a mage. Cast a fucking spell. Do anything. Hit me. Punish me for using my entire stamina bar, please. This is going to be the first time I've ever said this in a video, especially considering my own personal tastes, but this duo fight needs to be more aggressive. The breaking mechanic of the Crystallians makes for an engaging duo battle, if they decided to ever be one. Once the spear user is broken, I'm left with the choice of breaking the mage to swap between them, but when the mage decides to pose less of a threat than the Rams did in the first battle with a Deathbird, that interesting choice and design vanishes. This fight is still much closer to a solid battle than the first Crystallians, but doesn't get above a D grade. It doesn't put up the threat necessary to make the choices a duo fight inherently tries to create exciting. And especially as a pathway into the Academy, it's an underwhelming option. Smaragd is a strange boss in terms of world placement. Waking a sleeping dragon makes for a fun setting concept, and him having one of the keys to the Academy in his horde makes for a fun and natural feeling justification for the encounter. There's one problem, however. He's really bad at guarding said horde. That's right, the key Smaragd guards is not dropped by him. It just happens to be next to him, and there is absolutely no consequence to walking past him, grabbing the key, and leaving. Like Agheel, the moveset here suffers from the straightforward nature. Designed to be fought on top of Torrent, moves still come out just as slowly as they did for one of the game's earliest battles. And the opening of the fight, though unique, leads to the battle also being far less cinematic than Agheel, especially since there's so much less environment for Smaragd to destroy as the battle progresses, and the lingering magic doesn't invoke the same feeling of power that the flames did. Smaragd does boast one new move. He raises his head into the air, magic charges around him, crackling and spitting, his head recoils back from power, and he releases a single soul arrow that doesn't track well enough to hit a character with any momentum at all. It's almost funny how unthreatening this move is here. Smaragd still earns a C grade, but by the end of this fight in my first playthrough, my goodwill for the dragons was already starting to wear thin. They're impressive foes, but they just have so little depth. As we approach the end of part 1 of this series, we'll enter the Academy of Raya Lucaria with a semi-required battle against the Red Wolf of Radagon. A lot of large dog boss fights in From Software games seek to create movesets evocative of humanoid or monstrous bosses. Sif uses moves that later find use in Artorias, and the Great Wolf in Dark Souls 3 uses the Charge and Frost Breath attack of Vort, using long, slower bites than the dogs. The Red Wolf of Radagon, meanwhile, wants to give a dog enemy steroids and a staff, and it gives it a really unique and frantic feel even apart from the other dog bosses. Where Sif's moveset was precise and focused on each individual attack, and the Great Wolf focused on constant forward momentum and long lines of attack, the Red Wolf is always on the move, leaping to the side and spawning homing magic that will overlap with bites and lunges, spins, charges, leaping attacks with a flaming sword, stomps, or just soul arrows directly. The Red Wolf of Radagon always keeps the threat coming, often barely leaving enough time to heal between volleys. On the other hand, with only 2,204 health, I don't know why there's so many bosses that end health with 4, this is one of the most fragile bosses in Liurnia. Considering he stands as the required battle before the main Remembrance boss, it's clear they didn't want to make him too endurant with how hard he is to land a hit on. The best part about the fight is the way that the attacks overlap. It does a great job keeping the threat of the boss ongoing, while still not throwing any surprising moves at the player. Everything the Red Wolf does is telegraphed, but the fight's speed feels amplified by the overlapping of soul arrows alongside those bites and sword spins. Once everything is said and done, the Red Wolf presents a fun and opposing threat to the final boss you're heading towards. Rennala is a slower-paced battle that requires endurance and careful dodging against magic, whereas the Red Wolf captures the feeling of overwhelming magic and power that puts the player on the defensive while still not being so challenged as to overshadow that true featured foe of the Academy. There's an art to not being the best boss in a dungeon, and the Red Wolf of Radagon lands right where it needs to. The Red Wolf of Radagon earns an A grade. Serving as the sidekick to a more important boss may not be a glorious job, but the contrasting designs mean that the Red Wolf feels like a unique addition to the area while still aligning with its theme. Elden Ring's early game boss roster has primarily focused on small dungeons and foes. With the scale Elden Ring hopes to reach by the end, most of the heavy hitters wait for the mid-game or after to burst onto the scene. Margit foreshadowed a later battle, which really just left Godrick, whose entire story was about falling behind the power of the rest of his family. Rennala, however, is where the game really starts to leap into the mid-game. Though Godrick was a cinematic encounter, Rennala aims to raise that bar, setting a precedent for the level of scale Remembrance bosses will have moving forward. Firstly, Rennala's opening cutscene is unique as far as bosses go. Though the lighting and design of the students makes for an uncanny introduction, Rennala's introduction herself is rather passive, which does a great job preparing players for the nature of the fight to come. Rennala has no major attacks in the first phase of the first phase, so her passivity and the fact she hasn't even seemed to notice the player here makes for a really memorable introduction. Like the Deacons of the Deep, one of the students in the room is covered with a unique aura, this time golden. Once 3 of these auras have been broken, the player will get the chance to attack Rennala for some damage. 2 things distinguish the student that provides that shield. First, they'll constantly throw books that deal small chip damage at the player. Considering how hard it can be to look around the room and notice details, getting hit by a book lands in a perfect spot. It does a small enough amount of damage to feel insignificant and fair, while still being significant enough that it will add up over the course of the battle. The student will also be singing a nursery rhyme, so long as they're charging the shield, and the atmosphere that this creates is so beautifully uncomfortable. Especially as the music swells as the phase progresses, it makes for a far more engaging dance than the Deacons. There are more threats here as well. Instead of melee strikes like the Deacons, the students instead breathe fire, putting their emphasis entirely on chip damage. Meanwhile, some areas will occasionally gain a unique lighting and catch on fire. Moments later, a chandelier will fall from the ceiling, dealing a ton of damage and even hurting the students. Once Rennala's health is low enough, she'll start launching actual attacks, lifting the children up in an almost divine or rapturous way before shooting them as holy projectiles at the player for a fairly significant chunk of damage. Like the Deacons, there is not too much of a threat here so long as the player is cautious. Rather than using a curse meter as a damage test, however, Rennala uses this phase as an endurance test. Resources utilized here will be unavailable in the true boss fight that directly follows. After that first health bar is down, Ronnie, an NPC that the player will most likely have met, invokes Rennala in one of my favorite cutscenes in Elden Ring. This shot it builds to, with Rennala pointing towards you and the moon behind her, is gorgeously lit, and it makes the change in arena feel so smooth. Swapping from the disorganized, cluttered library with piles of books and furniture, making it impossible to walk in a straight line or really even think, to this open field, makes for an exciting change of pace and mimics Rennala's change. Rennala here is easy to stagger. Any hit will stop her in her tracks, meaning defensively she is one of, if not the weakest, remembrances. Her offense, however, makes for a really fun escalation of the tension the first phase utilized. She uses Comet Azure to start the fight, and regularly returns to it. The best way to dodge it is to be behind her, so it serves as a great moment to force the player to press in, while providing a massive threat for mistiming the action. Her stagger also comes in handy for her here, breaking out of the attack before it's done if you've managed to press in. She'll also summon glintstones that hone in on the player over time, quick soul arrows that need to be dodged, and magic missiles that float for a time before they hone in for a single moment. Finally, she can turn into a moon, becoming immune to all damage, before spawning an explosive projectile that she'll overlap with her other magic. In melee, she uses a staff throw that covers a wide area all around her. Press in and you're heavily rewarded, but if you misread, she has a staff spin that hits only the area directly in front of her as a dangerous get-off-me tool. With most bosses using AoEs to push players away, this makes for a really unique feel, especially considering the area of effect of much of her other magic. She encourages you to constantly press in towards her, then uses melee moves to punish rolling too far towards her. In terms of animations, there's one particular small detail I love here. The Red Wolf of Radagon set up that summoning magical sigils in the air created a soul arrow that homes on the player, a spell that the player themselves will have access to. That same sigil, when cast by Rennala, creates a barrage of missiles to be avoided. It makes Rennala feel like the master of magic that she is. Spells you've seen before are more powerful here upon this lake than they were prior. And, of course, to top it off, she has her summons. Placing a huge circle on the ground, Rennala will summon either a dragon, a troll, a Bloodhound Knight, or wolves. Each of these summons only last for about 10 seconds, but do provide a solid threat. The troll focuses on melee, forcing the player to move back or strafe for about 10 seconds. The Bloodhound Knight uses dashes to constantly close the distance, meaning they need to focus on dodging it. The dragon provides an excellent AoE threat, making the player need to be aware of their space, and the wolves... well, the wolves are a little out of place on this list. You can kind of just keep going for Rennala with occasional dodges if she brings them out. Considering how few melee options she does have, the summons and the moon combine really well for some unique disengaging tools that accomplish the same effect as an AoE while making Rennala still feel wholly unique. I've mentioned the Abyss Watchers before in this video, but that's because they're a good marking point. Rennala's position right at the cusp of the mid-game puts her in this same strange difficulty niche. She can put up a real threat, but her health can also feel really low. Her second phase boasts just over 4,000 hit points, and though she provides more heft than some previous threats, she lacks even the weight of other easy-to-combo enemies in Liurnia, like the Erdtree avatars. She suffers from this far less than the Abyss Watchers did, but there's a whole other group of areas players could have chosen to go to or started exploring before they came to the Academy. With that said, I think Rennala still earns an S grade. Taking the concept of an underwhelming boss from an earlier game and reshaping it as an endurance task that focuses entirely on building atmosphere into one of the game's best phase transitions to a boss that focuses on the yo-yo effect melee combat has in this series in a wholly unique way to other foes makes for an incredible experience for the player. But sadly, because I am but a human, that is where our first part will end today. The early game of Elden Ring has a lot of smaller bosses, as we only hit 2 of the big remembrances today, but the further we get, the more bosses like Rennala and Godrick will take the stage, and I'm excited to keep digging into them. A lot of personal life stuff made this video take a long while to finish, but I'm already getting through scripting part 2, which is going to cover most of the mid-game. The Underground, Nokron, Caelid, the Altus Plateau, and Mount Gelmir. There naturally might be some delays around late June for other Shadow of the Erdtree related reasons, and we'll see if I end up putting the bosses there into their own video or include them in part 3. Honestly, it depends on how that DLC handles bosses. Either way, if it takes me until after that DLC to finish the second part, then allow me to say, I'll see you all in the lands between. And thanks for watching. In this environment, on this lonesome road, it finally delivers the atmosphere this enemy desperately needed, as it tucks the battle away in one of the easier to find dark corners. The first spirits call... Until, of course, you yawn. Oh, man.